Değerli katılımcılar merhaba, ben Ahu Özyurt. Sabancı Üniversitesi Kurumsal Yönetim Forumu tarafından bu yıl 8.'si düzenlenen Türkiye Kadın Direktörler Konferansı'na hepiniz hoş geldiniz. Pandemi koşulları nedeniyle bu yıl ilk kez çevrim içi gerçekleşen Türkiye Kadın Direktörler Konferansı, kadınların şirket yönetimlerindeki konumunu ve iş dünyasında güçlendirilmesini ele almayı sürdürüyor. Konferansımızda simultane tercüme hizmeti var. Hatırlatalım. Lütfen dinlemek istediğiniz dili ekranınızın sağ köşesinde bulunan kısımdan seçebilirsiniz. We have simultaneous translation for our viewers and our participants. Please select the language if you want to listen from the right side of your screen. Hatırlatalım, çok katılımlı çevrim içi bir etkinlikteyiz. İnternet hızınıza bağlı kopmalar veya takılmalar olursa lütfen browser'ınızı tazeleyin. Sabancı Üniversitesi Yönetim Bilimleri Fakültesi'ne bağlı olarak çalışmalarını yürüten Kurumsal Yönetim Forumu, iklim değişikliği, toplumsal cinsiyet eşitliği ve iş dünyası, kurumsal yönetim ve sürdürülebilirlik başlıklarına odaklanarak şirketlerin toplumsal refaha katkılarını arttıracak öneriler geliştirmeyi amaçlıyor. Bu kapsamda 2013 yılından bu yana düzenlenen Türkiye Kadın Direktörler Konferansı'nın bu yılki teması kapsayıcı ve eşitlikçi bir gelecek olarak belirlendi. Konferansımızın ana konuşmacısı geçtiğimiz Ağustos ayında Uluslararası Para Fonu, IMF'de Strateji, Politika ve İnceleme Dairesi Başkanlığı gibi çok önemli görevi üstlenen sevgili Ceyla Pazarbaşıoğlu olacak. Ardından her yıl olduğu gibi bu yılda Yönetim Kurulu'nda Kadın Türkiye raporu ve sonrasında da kadınlarla güçlendirilmiş Yönetim Kurulu ödüllerini açıklıyoruz. Devamında ise programımızda 2 paralel oturum var, hatırlatalım değerli konuklar. Sabancı Üniversitesi Kurumsal Yönetim Forumu'nun yaptığı çalışmaları yakından takip etmek ve bu çalışmaların daha fazla kişiye ulaşmasını sağlamak, bize yardımcı olmak için sosyal medya hesaplarımızı da takip etmeyi unutmayın. Şimdi açılış konuşmalarına geçelim yavaş yavaş. %30 kulübü üyelerinden önce Limak Yatırım Yönetim Kurulu Başkanı Sayın Ebru Özdemir ve Sayın Zorlu Holding Yönetim Kurulu üyesi Selen Zorlu Melih'in ekranlarınıza getiriyoruz.
Bu yıl 8.'si düzenlenen Türkiye Kadın Direktörler Konferansı'nın öncelikle başarılı olmasını diliyorum. Konferansın düzenlenmesinde emeği geçen tüm kurum ve kuruluşlara teşekkür ediyorum. Yeni ekonominin olmazsa olmazı nitelikli insan gücü. Bu yeni ekonomi iş dünyasını fırsat eşitliği perspektifinde kurgulanmış, kapsayıcı iş modellerini geliştirmeye ve bunlara adapte etmeye itiyor. Bu noktada sürdürülebilir kalkınma ve özel sektörün kesişim kümesinde fırsat eşitliği bulunuyor. Ve bu çerçevede özel sektörde her kademede kadınların eşit temsilini çok kıymetli buluyorum. Adil yaklaşım bunu da beraberinde getiriyor. Dünyada kadınların iş hayatına katılmalarını sağlamak ve küresel rakamları arttırmak temel önceliklerden bir tanesi. Bu noktada özellikle yönetim katında kadınların oranını da arttırmamız gerekiyor. %30 kulübünün hedeflerini kıymetli buluyorum ve elimizden gelen her türlü desteği veriyoruz. Bizler için fırsat eşitliği çok önemli bir prensip. Sürdürülebilirlik gibi, kurumsallaşma gibi, dijital dönüşüm gibi. Bu konuları şirketimizin DNA'sına yerleştirmek istiyoruz. Şirket içi farkındalık çalışmalarımız ve sosyal yatırımlarımız ile bu konuyu canlı tutmaya çalışıyoruz. UNDP Türkiye ile birlikte yürüttüğümüz toplumsal cinsiyet eşitliği mührü programı ile Türkiye'de bir ilki gerçekleştiriyoruz. Limak Yatırım bünyesinde mühür programını tamamlayarak Türkiye'de bu mühre sahip ilk şirket olmayı hedefliyoruz. Sonrasında ise 2 hedefimiz daha var. Diğer şirketlerimize bu yaklaşımı yaymak, Türkiye'de diğer kurumlara örnek olmak. İnanıyorum ki bu ve benzeri projelerin artmasıyla bu alanda ülkemizde çok önemli gelişmeler sağlayacağız. Çok teşekkür ediyorum.
%30 kulübünün değerli üyeleri, değerli misafirler. Öncelikle hepinize hoş geldiniz diyor. Herkes için keyifli ve verimli bir konferans olmasını diliyorum. Yaşanan pandemi sebebiyle hayatın her alanında oldukça zorlandığımız bir süreçten geçiyoruz. Elbette süreç herkes için farklı açılardan zorlayıcı. Ancak tüm dünyada yapılan araştırma ve çalışmalar gösteriyor ki kadınlar ve çocuklar için mevcut olan eşitsizlikler bu dönemde iyice arttı. Özellikle kayıtlı ya da kayıt dışı çalışan kadınlar için koşullar daha da zorlayıcı hale geldi. Yine de bu koşulların kapsayıcı ve eşitlikçi bir toplum oluşturma yolunda hepimiz için bir fırsat olduğuna inanıyorum. Çünkü bu süreç bize hayatın zorluklarıyla baş etmek için çeşitliliğe, kapsayıcı bir kültürde yeşeren ortak akla, sağduyulu ve empati kurabilen liderlere, karar verme mekanizmalarına ne kadar çok ihtiyacımız olduğunu bir kez daha açık bir şekilde gösterdi. Özellikle esnek çalışma modellerinin ve dijitalleşmenin ön plana çıktığı bu dönemde hepimizin çok daha fazla inovasyona ve yaratıcılığa ihtiyacı var. Bunu bize sağlayacak en önemli güç ise elbette çeşitlilik ve kapsayıcılık. Yönetim kurullarının esnek ve çevik şekilde karar almak durumunda kaldığı bu tarihi süreçte toplantıyı yapıyor olmamız tam da bu sebeple bizler için çok büyük bir fırsat. Çeşitliliğin ve kapsayıcılığın yönetim kurullarında yarattığı gücü ve sinerjiyi ne kadar iyi kullanabilirsek bu süreci o kadar kolay atlatabilir ve dahası kurumlarımız ve şirketlerimizin bu süreçten daha da güçlenerek çıkmasını sağlayabiliriz. Zorlu grubu olarak kadınların iş dünyasında ve yaşamın her alanında daha fazla yer alması için pandemi dönemini bir fırsat olarak görüyoruz. Bu düşünceyle eşit bir hayat herkes için mümkün mottosuyla hareket ederek toplumsal cinsiyet eşitliği manifestomuz doğrultusunda iş gücüne eşit katılımdan kadın lider ve yönetici sayısının artırılmasına kadar uzanan birçok taahhütümüz doğrultusunda daha da büyük bir inançla çalışmayı sürdürüyoruz. Bu dönemde daha da artan ev içi şiddete karşı da çalışmalarımızı hızlandırdık. Tüm çalışma arkadaşlarımız için psikolojik, hukuksal, sosyal destek mekanizmalarını güçlendirecek yöntemler geliştirdik. Her açıdan öğrenimlerimizi pozitif çıktılara çevirmek için çalışıyoruz. Kapsayıcı ve eşitlikçi bir gelecek için 130 kulübü başta olmak üzere bütün paydaşlarımızla birlikte çalışmaya, deneyimlerimizi her zamanki gibi paylaşmaya devam edeceğimizi bu vesileyle bir kez daha ifade etmek istiyorum. Herkes için güzel bir gün olmasını diliyor, zengin içeriğiyle hepimiz için çok değerli mesajlar içeren etkinlikte ve bugün takdim edilecek araştırma raporunda emeğe geçen herkese teşekkürlerimi sunuyorum.
Sayın Özdemir ve Sayın Zorlu Melih'e çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Hakikaten pandemi döneminde hem çok zorlanıyoruz hem de birbirimizin ve kadınların değerini daha iyi anlıyoruz, daha çok konuşuyoruz. Bu çok önemli bir fırsat ve bunu daha iyi değerlendirelim. Açılış konuşmaları için tekrar teşekkür edelim ve konferansımızın ana konuşmasını yapmak üzere IMF Strateji, Politika ve İnceleme Dairesi Başkanı sevgili Ceyla Pazarbaşoğlu'nu ekrana davet edelim.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be joining you today. The topic of building an inclusive and equitable future is a very timely one, especially during this pandemic. And today I'm going to focus my remarks on the role that women and gender-based policies can play in building this future, in securing such a future. Malala Yousafzai, who indeed represents our future, said we cannot all succeed when half of us are held back. So it's particularly encouraging to be able to speak today to a group of female leaders and directors. Whether you realize it or not, you are already playing a role to help foster the resilience we will need to get through this crisis. Why do I say this? In 2017, IMF research showed that banks with higher shares of women board members had higher capital buffers, had a lower proportion of non-performing loans, and greater resilience to financial stress. Staff also found the same relationship between bank stability and presence of women on banking regulatory boards. Having served as the vice president of the BDDK, I can testify to the importance of diversified views in good decision making. Another IMF study, which looked at 2 million firms in 34 European countries, found that greater gender diversity in senior positions was associated with higher profitability of firms. And the study also found that one woman in senior management or on a corporate board is associated with much higher return on assets. So as these analyses show, increased female representation and diversity in senior positions is not only the right thing to do, it is also good for the bottom line. Our managing director, Kristalina Georgieva, said in a recent blog, "What is good for women is ultimately good for addressing income inequality, economic growth, and resilience." Yet, we still have a very steep ascent ahead. Even before the crisis began, the global average female labor force participation in 2019 was about 20 percentage points lower than male labor participation. And unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic is likely to exacerbate gender inequality. Women are more likely to work in face-to-face jobs that have been more acutely affected by the social distancing measures. And because of the nature of these jobs, teleworking is not an option. In the United States, about 54% of women working in social sectors cannot telework. In Brazil, it's 67%. In low-income countries, it's more than 88% who cannot telework. Women are also more likely than men to be employed in informal sectors in low-income countries. Informal employment, often compensated in cash with no official oversight, leave women with lower pay and without labor law protection and benefits such as pensions or health insurance. Women also bear the brunt of family care responsibilities. Even before the COVID crisis struck, women performed on average 2.7 hours more unpaid work than men per day. In many instances, the burden of household work for women has increased as a result of the shutdown measures such as school closures. After shutdown measures have been lifted, women are slower to return to employment. Among parents with at least one child under the age of 6, men were roughly 3 times more likely to have returned to work than women. Pandemics also put women at greater risk of losing human capital, which is a big concern. In many developing countries, young girls are forced to drop out of school and work to supplement household income. According to the Malala Fund report, the share of girls not attending school nearly tripled in Liberia after the Ebola crisis, and they were less likely than boys to re-enroll at school or go back to work. And so, without education, these girls suffer a permanent loss of human capital, sacrificing productivity growth and perpetuating the cycle of poverty among women. So how can we build a more inclusive and equitable future amid these challenges? And this is very critical because policymakers play a very important role. They need to adopt measures to limit the scarring effects of the pandemic on women. This could entail a focus on extending income support to the vulnerable, preserving employment linkages, providing incentives to balance work and family care responsibilities, improving access to healthcare and family planning, and expanding support for small businesses and the self-employed. To help women, this can include increased access to finance and addressing the gender gap in financial services, eliminating the legal barriers to women's economic empowerment is also a very high priority. So far, only 41% of countries have introduced measures to protect women's economic security in the face of the pandemic, but some countries have moved quickly. For example, Austria, Italy, and Portugal and Slovenia have introduced statutory rights to partially paid leave for parents with children below a certain age. France has expanded sick leave to parents impacted by school closures if no alternative care or work arrangements can be found. Latin American women leaders have established a coalition of action for the economic empowerment of women as part of a wider whole of the government effort to increase women's participation in the post-pandemic economic recovery. So these are all very good measures, and such policies can be designed to tackle gender inequality by creating conditions and incentives for women to be able to work and contribute to economic outcomes. These policies are not only crucial to lift constraints on women's economic empowerment, they are necessary to promote an inclusive post-COVID-19 recovery. So let me turn now to financial inclusion, using Turkey as an example. Back in 2018, while I was at the World Bank, we found that only 54% of women in Turkey had a bank account, compared with 83% of men. This 29 percentage point gender gap is three times large as the average gender gap in emerging economies. In fact, Turkey has one of the largest financial inclusion gender gaps in the world. One challenge to closing the gender gap is that 89% of unbanked women do not participate in the labor force. The same is true of unbanked men. The good news is that the digital technologies are presenting an opportunity to expand financial inclusion and help us close the gender gap. In Turkey, about 9 out of 10 women have a mobile phone, potentially offering convenient access to digital finance and opportunities for transformation that could take place through digitalization. In my role as the United Nations Secretary General's Task Force on Digital Financing of Sustainable Development Goals, we have been exploring how digitalization can help tackle the world's most urgent development challenges and promote greater growth and inclusion. And COVID-19 has only magnified and amplified this mandate. We found that both public and private sectors, the COVID-19 pandemic has created new opportunities for digital financial services to accelerate and enhance financial inclusion amid social distancing and containment measures. In the private sector, businesses have also moved quickly to leverage the power of digital technologies. These initiatives will help all, including women who lack basic access to finance. But countries must invest in digital infrastructure and digital identity so that their citizens can access online services. I want to end on a positive note. There are ways, big and small, locally and globally, that can make a difference and help build an inclusive and equitable future. While things may seem at times daunting, the pandemic also presents an opportunity, the greatest opportunity of our lifetime, to usher an inclusive and equitable future. So let us make sure that women have their equal share. Thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to contribute. Thank you.
Sevgili Ceyla Pazarbaşıoğlu'na çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Hakikaten kriz dönemlerinde kritik görevlerdeki kadınların ne kadar etkin görev yaptığını bu pandemi bize çok iyi gösterdi. Onun için boşuna değil, kendisi BDDK'da görev yaptığı dönemi hatırlatırken bizim de aklımıza şu dönemde parayı yöneten önemli isimler Christine Lagarde, Kristina Georgieva geliyor. Sevgili Ceyla Pazarbaşı da onlardan biri. Şimdi onun bahsettiklerini biraz daha açacağız. Hem 30'lar Kulübü'nü hem dijitalliğin hayatımıza kadınlara nasıl fırsatlar getirdiğini daha çok konuşacağız. Ama biraz durumun resmini de çekelim. Sabancı Üniversitesi Kurumsal Yönetim Forumu her yıl yönetim kurullarında kadınların oranı ile ilgili verileri büyük bir titizlikle derliyor, kamuoyuyla paylaşıyor. Sonrasında Sabancı Üniversitesi Yönetim Bilimleri Fakültesi öğretim üyeleri tarafından geliştirilen bir yönteme göre de değerlendiriliyor ve kadınlarla güçlendirilmiş yönetim kurulu ödülünü hak eden şirketler açıklanıyor. Biz önce bir durumun resmini çekeceğiz. Sabancı Üniversitesi Kurumsal Yönetim Forumu kurucu direktörü ve baş araştırmacısı Sayın Melsa Ararat, yönetim kurulunda kadın, Türkiye 2020 yılı raporunu açıklayacak. Biz de onu ekranlarımıza davet edeceğiz bu önemli raporu paylaşmak için.
Değerli katılımcılar, 8. Kadın Direktörler Konferansı'na hoş geldiniz. Farklı oturumlara 1000'in üzerinde kayıt yapılan bu konferansın amacı, Borsa İstanbul şirketlerinin yönetim kurullarında toplumsal cinsiyet eşitliği konusundaki gelişmeleri ve eğilimleri paylaşmak. 2012 yılından beri her sene 31 Ağustos itibarıyla pay sahipleri genel kurullarında seçilen yönetim kurulu üyeleriyle ilgili verileri topluyor. Üyeleri cinsiyetlerine, görevlerine ve statülerine göre analiz ediyor ve sonuçları kamuya açıklıyoruz. Türkiye'deki durumu Dünya ve Avrupa Birliği ile karşılaştırarak raporluyoruz. Bu sunumda da önce Türkiye'nin toplumsal cinsiyet eşitliği konusundaki genel resmine karşılaştırmalı olarak bakacağız. Daha sonra biz şirketleri yönetim kurullarında kadınların rolünü daha yakından inceleyeceğiz. Önce kısa bir özet vermek isterim. 2020 yılında Borsa İstanbul'da 397 şirket kayıtlıydı. Bu şirketlerin yönetim kurullarında 458 sandalyede 358 kadın oturmaktaydı. Kadınların oranı %17 oldu. Kadın CEO'ların oranı ise değişmeyerek %2,5'te kaldı. Şirketlerin yaklaşık %34'ünün yönetim kurulları tamamen erkeklerden oluştu. Bu 134 şirketin yönetim kurullarında kadın olmadığı anlamına geliyor. Şimdi biraz genel resme bakalım. Büyük resim bize neler söylüyor? Dünya Ekonomik Forumu'nun 2019 verilerine dayanarak yaptığı sıralamaya göre 153 ülke arasında Türkiye toplumsal cinsiyet eşitliği sıralamasında 130. sırada. 2018'de de 130'du. Ondan önce de %31, %30 olarak sıralamaya girmişti. Bu genel sıralamanın bileşenlerinden bizim açımızdan en önemli olan iki tanesinden söz etmek istiyorum. İlki economic participation, yani ekonomik katılım ve fırsatlar açısından sıralama. Ki burada Türkiye 2018'de 131. sıradayken 136. sıraya geriledi. Politik reprezentasyon, yani parlamentoda kadınların temsili sıralamasında ise Türkiye biraz gelişme göstererek yine kötü bir sıraya yerleşti, 109. sırada. Bu resim önemli çünkü ülkelerin genel durumuna baktığımızda parlamentoda, siyasi temsilde kadın oranıyla şirketlerin, yani ekonomik karar mekanizmalarındaki kadınların oranı arasında bir bağlantı olduğunu görmekteyiz. Şimdi Avrupa'ya bir bakalım. Avrupa'da Avrupa Birliği üyesi 28 şirketin yönetim kurullarındaki kadın oranı burada gördüğünüz gibi 28,8'e ulaşmış durumda. Bu kırmızı çizgiler Avrupa ülkeleri arasında yasal kota uygulayan şirketleri gösteriyor. Gördüğünüz gibi yasal kota uygulayan şirketlerde bu oran daha yüksek. Avrupa Birliği'nde %28,8 kadınların oranı, OECD averajı ortalaması %25,5, dünya ortalaması ise %19'da. Katılım desteği alan ülkelere baktığımızda, ki Türkiye'de bunlar arasında %17,9 civarında bir ortalama var. Türkiye bunun altında kalmış durumda. Parlamentodaki duruma baktığımızda yine Avrupa ve Türkiye'yi karşılaştırarak Avrupa Birliği'nin 28 ülkesinde parlamentoda temsil oranı %32,2'yi bulmuş durumda. Yine gördüğünüz gibi bu kırmızı çizgiler kotayı göstermekte. Kota olan şirketlerde daha hızlı bir ilerleme olduğunu görmekteyiz. Katılım desteği alan ülkelere baktığımızda orada da durumun Avrupa Birliği kadar iyi olmasa bile seneler içerisinde ilerleme gösterdiğini görüyoruz ama Türkiye yine ortalamaların altında kalan bir siyasi temsil oranına sahip görünüyor. Yıllar içerisinde Avrupa Birliği ve Türkiye'de yönetim kurullarında kadınların oranındaki ilerlemeye bakarsak gördüğünüz gibi yakın iken Avrupa Birliği ve Türkiye'deki ortalamalar 2011-2012 yılında, 2012 yılında bağımsız üyelerin zorunlu kılınmasıyla birlikte ve çoğu, hemen hemen tamamının bağımsız üyelerin erkeklerden seçilmiş olması nedeniyle kadın oranında bir düşüş yaşadık ve bunun arkasından oluşan farklılığı, uçurumu kapatmayı henüz maalesef başaramadık. Biraz daha yakından bakarsak Türkiye'deki yönetim kurullarının durumuna, 2020 itibarıyla Türkiye'de 2698 yönetim kurulu sandalyesinde 811 bağımsız yönetim kurulu üyesi ve 458 kadın üye sandalyesi bulunmaktaydı. Yıllar içerisindeki gelişmelere baktığımızda yönetim kurulu sandalye sayısının azaldığını görüyoruz. Şirket sayısının, halka açık şirket sayısının azalmasıyla birlikte. Bağımsız üyelerin yasal zorunluluk olan %30'a yakınsadığını görüyoruz. Kadınların oranında ise çok marjinal bir ilerlemenin her sene gerçekleştiğini görmekteyiz. Ancak bu resimlere bakarken dikkatimizi çekmesi gereken bir husus da şu: yönetim kurullarında yer alan kadınların tamamı cam tavanı delerek o konuma gelmiş kadınlar değil. Yönetim kurullarındaki üyelerin önemli bir çoğunluğu hem erkeklerin hem kadınların şirketlerin hakim ortakları olan ailelerle ilişkili kişiler. %29'u bütün direktörlerin hakim ortak olan ailelerin mensupları. Ancak bu oran kadınlar arasında çok daha yüksek. Bütün kadınların %42'si yönetim kurullarında yer alan bu hakim ortak olan ailelerin mensupları. Dolayısıyla rakamlara biraz daha tedbirli yaklaşmak gerektiğini görebiliyoruz. Bütün şirketlere baktığımızda giderek artan oranda şirketlerin yönetim kurullarında kadınların yer aldığını görmekteyiz. Ama hala şirketlerin %33.8'inde tamamı erkeklerden oluşan yönetim kurulları bulunmakta. Bu da toplamda %134 şirkete karşılık vermekte. Diğer ülkelere baktığımızda genel olarak daha büyük şirketlerin yönetim kurullarında daha yüksek oranda kadınların olduğunu görüyoruz ve bu büyük şirketlerde hemen hemen gelişmiş piyasalarda kadın üyesi olmayan şirketin kalmadığını görüyoruz. Ancak Türkiye'de durum farklı. Türkiye dünyadan o anlamda da ayrılıyor. Örneğin Borsa İstanbul'un en büyük şirketlerinden oluşan, ekonomik olarak en önemli şirketlerinden oluşan BIST 100 indeksine baktığımızda hala BIST 100 indeksi içinde yer alan 25 şirketin yönetim kurulunda kadın olmadığını görüyoruz. Ve buradaki ilerleme son yılda biraz hızlanmakla beraber yıllar içerisinde çok yavaş değişmiş. Peki kadınlar yönetim kurullarına nasıl, nereden giriyorlar? Burada gördüğünüz gibi yönetim kurullarındaki kadın oranı %17'ye çıkmış iken bağımsız üyelerin oranı daha düşük bir oran olan %7.7'den başlayarak 2012'de yavaşça artmış ve daha sonra artış hızı genel olarak yönetim kurullarındaki kadın oranının artış hızını geçmiş ve 18.5'e oturmuş durumda. Bu şunu gösteriyor: kadınların yönetim kurullarına girme noktası genel olarak bağımsız yönetim kurulu üyesi pozisyonlarında. Biraz önce demiştim ki ailelerin önemli oranda temsilinden dolayı rakamlara tedbirli yaklaşmak lazım. Eğer sadece profesyonel kadınlara dikkat alırsak, yani ailelerle ilişkili olan üyeleri bir kenara bırakırsak, değersiz oldukları için değil ama aynı zorluklarla cam tavanı delmek durumunda kalmadıkları için profesyonel kadınların bütün direktörler arasındaki, yönetim kurulu üyeleri arasındaki oranı sadece %9.8. Yine ilginç bir başka resimde gördüğünüz gibi burada ortadaki koral renk seneler içinde icrada görevli kadınların oranını yansıtmakta. Alttaki açık portakal rengi ise bağımsız üyelerin oranını yansıtmakta tüm kadınlar arasında. Tüm kadın üyeler arasında giderek artan oranda bağımsız yönetim kurulu üyesi kadınları görürken icrada görevli kadınlarda herhangi bir değişiklik olmadığını ve icrada görevli olmayan ama bağımsız da olmayan üyelerin, ki bunlar genellikle iş gruplarında başka şirketlerin görevli memurları kadınlar olabiliyorlar. Burada bir düşüş olduğunu görmekteyiz. Ama icrada görevli kadınların oranında ve sayısında herhangi bir değişiklik yok. 2020 yılına bakarsak örneğin 458 sandalyenin 89'unda sadece icrada görevli kadın direktörler oturmaktaydı. Ama bunların yine önemli bir kısmı aile mensubu olan kadınlardı. Profesyonel ekzekütifler, yani icrada görevli profesyonel direktörlerin oranı %6.8'de kaldı. Sayılara bakarsak zaten bunu görüyoruz. Gördüğünüz gibi bağımsız üyeler oranında giderek artan sayıda kadını görmekteyiz. Diğer profesyoneller diyebileceğimiz, bağımsız olmayan eksekutif, icracı ve icracı olmayan üyelerin sayılarında ise yıllar itibarıyla bir değişiklik görmüyoruz. Aynı şekilde aileyle ilişkili kadınların oranında da icracı olmayan rollerde pek bir değişiklik görmüyoruz. İcracı rollerde bir artış görüyoruz. Bu da demektir ki şirketler giderek daha fazla aile mensubu olan kadınların eksekutif, icracı rollerde olmasına sıcak bakıyor. Başka bir ilginç gelişme ise komite yapılarında. Yönetim kurulu komiteleri önemli organlar. Bu organlarda kadınların oranının %17.5 civarında gerçekleştiğini görüyoruz 2020 yılında. Giderek artan oranda yer aldılar kadınlar komitelerde. Buradaki yer alma oranlarının %17 civarında olması bir kez yönetim kurullarına girdikten sonra kadınların komitelere seçilme konusunda önlerinde bir engel olmadığı ve önemli görevlere rahatlıkla atandıklarını gösteriyor. Hatta biraz daha yakından bakarak bu duruma komite başkanlarının kadınlardan seçilmesindeki gelişmeyi gösteriyorum şu anda ekranda size. Ve gördüğünüz gibi risk komitesi başkanlarının %19'u yaklaşık olarak kadınlardan oluşuyor. Bu da kadınların riskleri değerlendirme konusundaki yetkinliklerine daha fazla güvenildiğini işaret ediyor. Kurumsal yönetim komitesi üyeliklerinde, başkanlıklarında ve denetim komitesi başkanlıklarında da ilk yıllardaki 2013-2014'teki düşük oranlara göre önemli artışlar görmekteyiz. Yönetim kurulu başkanlıklarına gelince, yönetim kurulu başkanlıklarını aileler kolay kolay bırakmıyorlar. 260 yönetim kurulu başkanı kontrol eden ailelerin mensuplarından oluşuyor. 137 tanesi sadece profesyonel ve bağımsız üyeler arasından seçilen yönetim kurulu başkanları Türkiye'de görülmüyor. Oysa ki iyi kurumsal yönetim ilkelerinin arasında yer almakta yönetim kurulu başkanlarının bağımsız üyeler arasından seçilmesi. Yine kadınların oranına baktığımızda kadınların %9.3 oranında yönetim kurulu başkanlıklarında bulunduklarını görüyoruz. Ama bunların yine önemli bir kısmı ailelerin mensubu olan kadınlar. Profesyonel olup yönetim kurulu başkanı rolünde olan kadınların oranı ise sadece %2. CEO'ların durumunda da pek bir ilerleme olmadığını söylemiştim. Gördüğünüz gibi 2013 yılından beri yönetim kurulunda yer alan kadın CEO'ların sayısında hiçbir değişiklik yok. Oranında da bir değişiklik yok. %2.5. Burada yine dikkat çekmek gereken bir husus var. Türkiye'de yönetim kurulu başkanlarının aynı zamanda CEO rolünü üstlenmeleri çok yaygın. Şirketlerin %57'sinde icranın tepesindeki kişiyle yönetim kurulu başkanı aynı kişi. Sadece %43'ünde bir başka CEO yönetim kurulunda yer almakta. Bu durum Avrupa'daki durumdan çok farklı değil veya dünyadakinden ama oranlar farklı. Yani genel olarak bakarsak evet kadınların oranı yönetim kurullarında artmakta ama CEO oranlarında pek bir artış görmüyoruz. Örneğin Avrupa'da kadın CEO'ların oranı %7.7, dünya ortalaması %5, Türkiye bunun yarısı kadar. Yönetim kurullarında ise yine EU'daki ortalama Türkiye'nin üstünde 7.5 ama bunların tamamının profesyonel olduğunu düşünürsek yine kadın profesyonellerin Avrupa'ya kıyasla çok daha düşük oranlarda yönetim kurulu başkanlıklarına getirildiğini söylememiz mümkün. Ama ilginç bir durum, executive oranlar, yani icrada görevli yönetim kurulu üyesi oranları Türkiye'de ve Avrupa'da aynı. Bunun bir sebebi de Avrupa'daki 2 seviyeli yönetim kurulu yapıları. Hollanda, Almanya ve Fransa'da tercihe bağlı olarak 2 aşamalı yönetim kurulları var. En tepedeki yönetim kurullarında hiç icracılar yer almıyor. Dolayısıyla esasında tam bir ayrım var, icracı olan ve icracı olmayan üyelerden oluşan 2 yönetim kurulu kurularak. Bu rakamı biraz tedbirli yorumlamak gerekiyor bu nedenle. Sektörlere baktığımızda çok büyük farklılıklar görmüyoruz. Uzun yıllardır, başından beri bu durumu takip ettiğimiz yılların başından beri finans sektörü kadın üye oranının yönetim kurullarında en yüksek olduğu sektör olmaya devam ediyor. %18.4 ile. Kurumsal yönetim indeksi daha iyi olmasını beklediğimiz yönetim kurullarında çeşitliliğin maalesef aynı oranda ortalamayla, genel ortalamayla. Ve sürdürülebilirlik endeksi de hemen hemen finansal endeksi yakalamış durumda. Bu konferansı birlikte organize ettiğimiz 130 kulübün üyeleri ise bütün bunlardan daha yüksek oranda, %20 oranında kadın üyeye sahip oldular 2020 yılında. Özetlemek gerekirse gelişmenin acı verecek ölçüde yavaş olduğunu söyleyebiliriz. Kadınların giderek kritik rollere atandıklarını söyleyebiliriz. Yönetim kurullarının aileler tarafından seçilen üyelerinin yönetim kurullarında kemikleştiğini, dolayısıyla yönetim kurullarının tazelenmesinin çok yavaş gerçekleştiğini söyleyebiliriz. Daha eski şirketlerin yönetim kurullarının daha kemikleşmiş olduğunu da eklemek gerek buna. Kadınların yönetim kurullarına esasen bağımsız üye konumunda girdiklerini ve icracı rollerde kadınların rolünün yıllar itibarıyla hiç değişmediğini söylemek mümkün. Eğer başka tedbirler alınmazsa mevcut politikalarımızla ve mevcut durumda %25'e ulaşmak, ki Sermaye Piyasası Kurulu'nun önerdiği minimum oran olan %25 kadın oranına ulaşmak için 11 seneye ihtiyacımız var. 2031, ki Avrupa Birliği 2026 yılında dengeye ulaşacağını öngörmekte. %40 kadın oranına ulaşarak yönetim kurullarında. Genel hedefimiz olan %30'a ulaşmak için ise 15 yıl beklemek gerekecek. 2036. Bunlar çok uzun, pek tahammül edilebilecek ne ekonomimiz açısından ne kadınlarımız açısından yıllar. Peki neler yapılabilir? Yine dünyadaki gelişmelere ve Türkiye'deki duruma baktığımızda öyle görünüyor ki Avrupa Birliği'nin toplumsal cinsiyet eşitliği konusundaki kararlılığı bütün ülkelerde bu alanda ilerlemelerin itici güçlerinden biri olmuş. Demek ki Avrupa Birliği politikalarıyla uyumlu hale getirmek, Türkiye politikalarını ve katılım sürecinin hızlanmasına destek olmak hem şirketlerimiz açısından hem de kadınlar açısından önemli. Kotaların işe yaradığını görmekteyiz. Daha yumuşak yasalar diyebileceğimiz kamuya açıklama ya da raporlama ya da hedef koyma gibi regülasyonların ise eğer enforce edilebilirlerse işe yaradıklarını görmekteyiz. Bu enforce etme durumu tabii ki piyasalar aracılığıyla olabildiği gibi yine düzenleyici otoriteler aracılığıyla da olabilir. Bunlar da işe yarıyor. Bu konuda da mevcut düzenlemelerimizi güçlendirmemiz mümkün. Şirketlerin örnek olmaları, liderlik yapmaları ve akranları üzerinde sosyal baskı uygulamalarının işe yaradığını görmekteyiz. %30 kulübünün çalışmalarına dayanarak. Dolayısıyla kulübün büyümesi, kulüp üyelerinin artması da işe yarayacak stratejiler arasında. Kadınlar arasındaki dayanışma her zaman kadınların daha ileri noktalara gelmesinde birinci derecede önemli olmuştur. Dolayısıyla yönetim kurullarında yer alan kadınların ve çalışanların yönetim kurullarında daha fazla kadının yer alması konusunda yönetimlerine, ortaklarına telkinlerde bulunmaları, desteklemeleri, kadın adayları işe yarayacak stratejiler arasında. Ama galiba en önemlisi ülkede bir bütün olarak toplumsal cinsiyet eşitliği konusundaki farkındalığın ve iradenin, politik iradenin tezahür etmesi. Çünkü görüyoruz ki şirket yönetiminde kadınların daha fazla yer aldığı ülkelerin hemen hemen tamamında parlamentoda temsil ondan daha yüksek. Biz aynı noktadayız. Demek ki politik temsilde, politikaları üreten organlarda kadınların temsili bir bütün olarak ekonomik karar mekanizmalarında da kadınların daha fazla yer almasına sebep olacaktır. Sözlerimi bitirmeden önce bu konferansın hazırlanmasında desteklerini esirgemeyen destekçilerimiz Akbank'a, IFC'ye, Limak'a ve Zorlu Holding'e çok teşekkür ediyorum. Kulübün, %30 kulübünün konferans komitesi üyeleri Şahika Özcan Ortaç, Sevan Kılıçyan ve Pınar Anapa'ya çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Ve Kurumsal Yönetim Forumu ekibinden Sevda Alkan'a, Firuze Alpaytın'a ve Ulaş Eraslan'a teşekkür ediyoruz. Bu resimde gördüğünüz gibi günümüzün kadın liderleri, babaannelerimizin, anneannelerimizin kadın liderleri değil, çok farklı kadınların hem politik hayatta hem de ekonomik hayatta lider konuma geldiklerini ve bu konumlarında uyguladıkları politikalarla geleneksel rollerini bu organizasyonların, partilerin, şirketlerin değiştirdiğini görüyoruz. Umutlu olmak için çok neden var. Çok teşekkür ederim.
Sevgili Melsa Ararat'a çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Yolumuz uzun, biraz da yokuşumuz dik. Gelişme acı verici derecede yavaş dedi sevgili Melsa Ararat ama kritik konumlara geldiğinde başarıyı da görüyoruz dedi kadınlar için. Ülkede bütünsel bir farkındalık ve politik irade gerekiyor dedi. Hem yönetim kurullarında hem siyasi liderlikte kadın sayısının artması için. Şimdi az evvel bahsettiği önemli bir kuruma bakalım. Avrupa İmar ve Kalkınma Bankası EBRD, Türkiye'de önemli yatırımları olan bir kurum. Kadınların yönetim kurullarında etkin şekilde rol almaları ve yatırımlara etkisini araştırıyor ve bunda da olabildiğince bir pozitif korelasyon görüyor. EBRD 2019 yılında Türkiye'de yönetim kurullarında daha fazla kadınların yer almasına yönelik bir ulusal strateji, planlama ve yol haritası çalışması başlattı. Doktor Melsa Ararat'ın, az evvel dinlediğimiz sevgili Melsa Ararat'ın danışmanlığında yürütülen sürece konuyla ilgili bütün kurumlar da katıldı. Şimdi EBRD'nin bu projeyle ilgili olan katılımcılara bir mesajı var, video mesajı. Bir onu izleyelim.
Message for everyone. Let's watch this. Hanımefendiler ve beyefendiler, Avrupa İmar ve Kalkınma Bankası adına sizlere bu toplumsal cinsiyet eşitliği, özellikle Türkiye'de toplumsal cinsiyet eşitliğinin şirket yönetim kurullarındaki artırılmasına dair yol haritamızı sizlere sunmak isteriz. Bir kurum olarak baktığımızda özellikle iyi yönetişime ve cinsiyet eşitliğine odaklanan bir kurum olarak biz de Sayın Ararat'la, Doktor Ararat'la birlikte çalışarak politika yapıcıları, konudaki mevzuat çalışmalarını artırmak adına kadınların temsiliyetini artırmak üzere çalıştık. Buradaki amacımız katılımı arttırmak ve olabildiğince daha iyi işleyen yönetim kurulları yaratmak ve daha iyi bir şirket performansı sağlamak adına neler yapılmalıyı aslında bir nevi bir yol haritasında çizdik. Bir şirketi bu konuda yönlendirmek adına gereken bütün çalışmaları yaptık. Böylece bunu yaratmamızla birlikte Türkiye'deki birçok paydaşı bu konuda dahil etmeyi başardık. Hem görev güçleri bunun içerisine dahil edildi hem de paydaşlar bu konuda büyük fayda sağladı. Hepsine çok teşekkür ediyoruz. İçeriğine baktığımızda ise bu yol haritasının 4 tane ana madde var. Biri farkındalık yaratmak. Burada aslında bir markalaşmayla birlikte işbirliği bir platform yaratmak ve aynı zamanda yardım götürebilmek. İkinci temamız, önemli nokta ise kapasiteyi arttırmak. Yani yönetim kurullarını alabilecek olan kadınların havuzunu genişletmek. Sertifikasyon programları bunun içerisinde dahil. Aynı zamanda buna stajyerlik de dahil. Diğeri de olabildiğince kendi kurumları içerisinde baktığımızda yönetim kurullarında sahip oldukları bu karmayı arttırmalarını sağlamak. Dördüncüsü ise yani yasal araçlara baktığımızda, yönetmeliksel araçlara baktığımızda mevcut yönetmelikleri uygulamak ve şirketlerin yeni yönetmelikler konusunda da inisiyatif almasını sağlamak. Geri bildirim almak aslında bu planlar üzerine çok önemli. İşte biz de bu yüzden bu alanda biz de yani bir nevi bir danışmanlık sağlamaya çağladık. Bütün ilgili tarafları bu konuya dahil etmek için bir yol çizdik. Aslında bir nevi taslağına bakarsanız siz de bu konuda zaten bize bu özellikle yol haritasının anketine de konferans materyalleri dahilinde ulaşabileceksiniz. Geri bildirimlerinizi bekliyoruz. Teşekkür ederiz. Dinlediğiniz için sağ olun. Umarız siz de Türkiye'deki şirket
Şimdi sevgili Ceyla Pazarbaşıoğlu'ndan da sevgili Melsa Ararat'tan da dinledik. Yönetime kadınları alan şirketler böyle kriz zamanlarından daha hızlı çıkıyorlar. Ekonomi yönetimlerinde kadınların yer aldığı devletlerde muhtemelen krizi daha iyi atlatacaklar. Peki biraz sıkıntılı bir yolumuz var, tamam, ama iyi yapanları da ödüllendirmek lazım. Kadınlarla güçlendirilmiş yönetim kurulu ödülünü hak eden şirketleri şimdi sizinle paylaşacağız. %30 kulübü Türkiye kampanyası kurucu üyesi ve yönetişim komitesi üyesi sevgili Agah Uğur'un mesajı ve sonrasında da ödül alan şirketlerden gelen mesajlar geliyor ekrana.
Sevgili üyelerimiz ve misafirlerimiz, yönetim kurulunda kadın temsilini arttırmak, toplumsal kalkınmayı desteklemektir. Çünkü kadınların liderlik rollerinde daha fazla yer bulmasının hem kurumların finansal performanslarına, hem küresel sürdürülebilirlik hedeflerine, hem de ekonomik kalkınmaya ciddi olumlu etkisi olduğu birçok araştırma ile ispatlanmıştır. Biz de %30 kulübü olarak kurumların her seviyesinde toplumsal cinsiyet dengesini iyileştirmek ve karar mekanizmalarında kadınların çok daha güçlü şekilde yer almasını sağlamak için çalışıyoruz. Yaptıklarımızdan gurur duyuyoruz ancak daha çok yapacak işimiz olduğunu ve yolumuzun da çok uzun olduğunu da biliyoruz. Bu yolculuğun önemli temel taşlarından birisi de başarıların ödüllendirilmesi. Bu kapsamda sizlere kadınlarla güçlendirilmiş yönetim kurulu ödüllerini alan şirketleri açıklamak istiyorum. BIST 100 içerisinde profesyonel kadın yönetim kurulu üyesi en az 2 olup Sabancı Üniversitesi Kurumsal Yönetim Forumu akademisyenleri tarafından geliştirilen endekste en yüksek puanı alan 3 şirket sırasıyla aynı zamanda %30 kulübü üyesi olan Aksa Akrilik, Tekfen Holding ve Koç Holding. Ayrıca yönetim kurulunda pariteye ulaşıp Yıldız Pazar'da endekste en yüksek puanı olan bir firmamız var. O da Türk Prizmian. Kazanan bu firmalarımızın hissedar ve tepe yöneticilerini tebrik ediyor. Onlara %30 kulübü adına teşekkür ediyor. Gelecekte bu ödüllere birçok yeni firmamızın aday olabilmesini diliyorum.
Herkese merhaba. Öncelikle size ve tüm sevdiklerinize sağlıklı günler diliyorum. Bu yıl 8.'si düzenlenen Kadın Direktörler Konferansı'nda Kadınlarla Güçlendirilmiş Yönetim Kurulu ödülüne layık bulunmaktan dolayı Aksa Akrilik olarak büyük bir mutluluk duyuyoruz. Aksa Akrilik ve çatısı altında bulunduğumuz Akgök Holding olarak yürekten inanıyoruz ki kadınların iş hayatına daha fazla dahil olmaları ve daha etkin görevler üstlenmeleri ülkemizin sosyal kalkınmasına da hız kazandıracaktır ve tüm toplumun refah seviyesini yukarı çekecektir. Ancak TÜSİAD'ın son yaptığı araştırmaya göre Covid sonrası dönemde çalışan kadınların %99'u artan ev işleri ve çocuk, yaşlı, hasta bakımı nedeniyle zorlukların arttığını söylüyor. %99. Bu dönemde kadın çalışanlarımızın sayısını artırmak bir yana mevcutları destekleyen ortamları sağlamak da önemli bir görevimiz. Kadınlarla güçlendirilmiş yönetim kurullarının bu konuda farkındalığının da yüksek olacağına inanıyorum. Aksa'da yönetim kurulumuzda bu yüksek kadın oranını yakalamış durumdayız ve tüm iş dünyasında da bu artışın yaşanması için %30 kulübü, yönetim kurulunda kadın derneği gibi çeşitli sivil toplum kuruluşlarının çalışmalarına da destek veriyoruz. Çünkü bilimsel araştırmalar gösteriyor ki yönetim kurullarında en az %30 oranında kadın bulunduğunda alınan kararların kalitesi niteliksel olarak artıyor. Bu oran aynı zamanda kişisel deneyimlerimden de çok rahat söyleyebilirim ki çeşitliliğin yönetim kurulu masası etrafında doğal olarak yaşanmaya başlandığı kritik bir seviye. Temennim şu ki her türlü zorlu koşula rağmen esnek ve çevik olmayı becerebilen bir Türk iş dünyası var. Bu iş dünyasının daha katılımcı ve kadın dostu bir çalışma ortamı ve yönetim kurulları için el ele verip kararlı adımlarla ve hızla ilerleyecektir. Sabancı Üniversitesi Kurumsal Yönetim Forumu'na böylesi anlamlı bir ödül ve tören için tekrar çok teşekkürlerimle keyifli bir konferans diliyorum.
Değerli katılımcılar, Covid-19 sebebiyle fiziken bir arada olamıyoruz. Sizleri video ile selamlıyorum. Pandeminin etkileri sadece fiziki koşullarımızla sınırlı kalmadı. Son yıllarda küresel seviyede artan eşitsizlikler farklı alanlarda ve boyutlarda somutlaştı. Pandemi sürecinde en çok etkilenenler ne yazık ki kadınlar oldu. Başta evlerinde bakmakla yükümlü oldukları kişilerle ilgili yükleri epeyce arttı. Daha da önemlisi aile içi şiddetin artışına ilişkin verileri izliyoruz. Birçok konuda olduğu gibi bu alanda da özel sektörün atacağı adımlar var. Bildiğiniz gibi Koç Holding, He for She programının küresel 10 etki liderinden biri. Bu çerçevede paydaşlarımızla birlikte kadınların karar alma mekanizmalarına dahil olmaları, toplumsal ve ekonomik hayata daha fazla katılmaları için yenilikçi çalışmalar yapıyoruz. Kadınlarla güçlendirilmiş yönetim kurulu endeksinde en yüksek puanı almamız bizler için gurur verici. Ben bu vesileyle ödül alan tüm şirketleri candan kutluyorum. Ayrıca başta Sabancı Üniversitesi Kurumsal Yönetim Forumu olmak üzere Bağımsız Kadın Direktörler Projesi'nde ve %30 kulübünde emeği geçen herkese içten teşekkür ediyorum.
Merhaba, herkesi saygı ve sevgiyle selamlıyorum. BIST 100 endeksinde işlem gören şirketler arasında bu yıl 3. kez kadınlarla güçlendirilmiş yönetim kurulu ödülünü almaktan çok gurur duyduğumu ifade etmek ve TR&EN Holding adına teşekkürlerimi sunmak isterim. Bu ödülü almak için bir erkek olarak karşınızda bulunmayı kaderin bir cilvesi olarak değerlendiriyorum. Yönetim kurulumuzda her fırsatta bilgi ve tecrübeleriyle kurumumuza çok değerli katkıları bulunan kadın üyelerimize, başta Sayın Cansevil Akçağlılara ve bağımsız üyelerimiz Sayın Neriman Ülsever, Sayın Gülsüm Azeri ve Sayın Cansen Başaran Sayms'a sizlerin huzurunda ayrı ayrı teşekkürü borç bilirim. Kurucu ortaklarımızdan rahmetli Feyyaz Berker'in uzun yıllar önce TÜSİAD'a bir kadın başkanın çok yakışacağını, bambaşka vizyon kazandıracağını ve bu konuda öncelik edilmesi gerektiğini her fırsatta dile getirdiğini çok iyi hatırlıyorum. O nedenle Arzuhan Hanım ve Ümit Hanım'dan sonra TÜSİAD başkanlığı yapmış Cansen Hanım'ın bu yıl aramıza katılmasının TEKFEN için ayrı bir anlamı olduğunu da bu vesileyle söylemek isterim. TEKFEN'in 20 bin kişiye yakın çalışanının sadece %9'u kadın. Mavi yakanın çoğunlukta olduğu uluslararası müteahhitlik ve sanayi sektörlerinde olduğumuz için bu oran gerçekçi bir oran. Ancak her seviyedeki yönetici arkadaşlarımız arasında kadın erkek eşitliğini sağlamak için büyük gayret gösteriyoruz. Bununla birlikte zorlu şantiyelerde, fabrika ve Ar-Ge laboratuvarlarımızda emek veren yüzlerce müthiş kadın mühendisimiz, TEKFEN Vakfı bursuyla okuyan mühendis, hukukçu, doktor adayı kadın öğrencilerimiz ve sağladığımız mikro kredi sayesinde aile ekonomilerine katkıda bulunan binlerce kadın girişimcimiz olduğunu iftiharla söyleyebilirim. Ülkenin en büyük tarım kuruluşu olarak kadının tarımsal üretime daha fazla dahil olmasına etki edecek gücümüzle buna yönelik çeşitli çalışmalar sürdürüyoruz. Yine Sabancı Üniversitesi'nin şemsiyesi altında hızla genişleyen BADV platformuna bu yıl dahil olmuş bir kurum olarak kısa süre içerisinde çok feyz aldığımızı ve projenin şirketlerimiz içerisinde hiç beklemediğimiz kadar gönüllü kazandığını memnuniyetle izliyoruz. Sözlerimi bitirirken Sabancı Üniversitesi'ne kadın konusundaki öncülüğü, buluşturuculuğu ve birleştiriciliği için yürekten alkışlıyor, bugün ödül alan diğer kurumları da gönülden kutluyorum. Sağlıkla kalın.
Other award-winning companies. Thank you.
Dear guests, let me first respectfully greet all participants in this special event that make us feel side by side in the digital environment, and also those who have contributed to its organization. The meaning of this award is great for us. First of all, because it rewards our group, Prysmian Group, worldwide leader in the cable business, where multiculturalism, diversity, and inclusion are fundamental pillars of the corporate culture at every latitude in the world. Secondly, because behind this award is the corporate identity of a manufacturing company, Turk Prysmian Cablo, where 50% of its board of directors is women, and also 35% of white-collar employees and 25% of its senior manager is women. And together with the other half of the universe, they make up a family of people devoted and passionate to our business, always looking ahead, aiming at new ambitious goals, combining innovation and long-term sustainable growth. This award is their award. Finally, please allow me, because it's a small, great award to a personal and professional challenge, that with great enthusiasm and looking beyond the comfort zone, I decided to embrace just over a year ago. Our mission is linking Turkey to the future, a future that clears the gap and bridges the distance, where economical needs, but also ethical and social ones, are included in the ecosystem. This is a moment which requires great courage. It's time to contribute to the creation and the development of distinctive skills, creating value through positive business models based on the growth of human capital. It's time for empowerment and growth through diversity, to foster a system open to new perspectives, which boosts the ability to innovate, but also to resist the unexpected. In conclusion, a heartfelt thanks to the Sabancı University Corporate Governance Forum and to all those who have decided to award this prize to Turk Prysmian Cablo. I pay my respect to everyone and wish you all to enjoy this wonderful event. Thank you.
Ödül alan şirketleri biz de gönülden tebrik ediyoruz. Sevgili Lale Develioğlu, sevgili Levent Çakıroğlu ve Sayın Osman Birgili, Türk Prysmian'ın sevgili yetkilileri, hepsi hakikaten hem gerçekçi bir resim koyuyorlar önümüze, hem de aslında iş dünyamızın bu meselede ne kadar iyi niyetli olduğunu ve ısrarcı olacağını da gösteriyorlar. Şimdi yavaş yavaş konferansımızın ikinci bölümüne geçiyoruz. Dediğimiz gibi şimdi artık iki panele ayrılacağız. Ekranınızın altında iki kutu göreceksiniz. Turuncu ve mavi, iki ayrı paralel panel var. Bunlardan birini seçeceksiniz. Bir refresh etmeniz gerekebilir, bilgisayarınızı hatırlatalım. İlk oturumun konusu çok konuştuk, hatırlayacaksınız bu %30 meselesini. Yönetim kurullarında çeşitlilikte dünyadan örnekler. İlk oturumumuz bu. Yani birinci, aynı anda paralel gidecek oturumlarımızdan. Konuşmacılarımız Birleşik Krallık Lordlar Kamerası üyesi ve aynı zamanda %30 kulübü yönlendirme komitesi üyesi Mary Goody ile Catalyst Başkanı ve CEO'su Lorraine Harrelton. Bu oturumu sevgili Murat Yeşildere modere edecek. Egon Zender kıdemli ortağı ve Türkiye'de iş dünyasında kadınlar konusunda hakikaten en öncü isimlerden biri. Paralel diğer oturumumuzun konusu yönetim kurullarında ve üst yönetimde toplumsal cinsiyet eşitliği konusunda gelecekteki araştırmaların yönü. Yani bu işin birazcık daha araştırmasal, rakamsal yönü. Moderatörlüğünü TESEV Araştırma Direktörü sevgili Itır Akdoğan yapıyor bu oturumunda. Bakalım onda kimler var? Konuşmacılarımız Oxford Üniversitesi Said İşletme Okulu Finans Profesörü Renee Adams, London School of Economics Finans Bölümü Başkanı ve Profesörü Daniel Ferreira ve Otto Baysam Yönetim Okulu Finans Profesörü Sayın Burçin Yurtoğlu. Paralel oturumlara katılmak için tekrar edelim. Ekranın alt kısmında bulunan ve seçtiğiniz hangi oturumsa onu tıklamanız yeterli. Soru sormak için de artık pek çoğunuz zaten formatı biliyorsunuz. Alt kısımda bulunan soru cevap butonuna yazı yazabiliyorsunuz, sorularınızı yazabiliyorsunuz. Moderatörlerimiz iletecek. Şimdi ben sizi yavaş yavaş paralel oturumlara göndereyim ve dinleyelim bakalım konuşmacılarımızdan yönetim kurullarında kadınların durumunda önümüzdeki yıllar ne gösteriyor?
Okay, I guess we can start. That's the message I got from the organizers. Well, I'm very privileged and proud to be with two wonderful panelists today. And once in a while, I'm the diversity element in the group. So I'm very proud to be the diversity element in this group. So two wonderful panelists. I have Lorraine Harrelton, who's the president and CEO of Catalyst. And probably for the first time ever in my humble career, I am with a Baroness Goody or Mary Goody. So I cannot tell you their long accomplishments and CVs, so I would not even dare to go into that. So we'll just deep dive into the subject where we would like to inspire you with some best practices from the experiences of Lorraine and Mary. Lorraine, let me start with you. So for some of us in the audience who are less familiar with Catalyst, tell us a bit about what Catalyst does and what are the strategic priorities.
Thank you very much, Murat. And I just want to say I'm really was looking forward to this this virtual conference here today. And because of virtual, I've been able to be here today. You know, I probably might not have gotten on a plane to Turkey, though I wish I could, because, you know, I really have a lot of warm memories of Turkey, because when I was at the State Department from 2009 to 2014, we launched a global entrepreneurship program there, and I spent quite a bit of time in Istanbul, and I was at Sabancı University. So I really I'm delighted to be back, and I have a lot of good friends in Turkey. Catalyst is a global nonprofit. We started in 1962, focused on making workplaces work for women. So we've been on that journey for a long time. Today, we are a global organization. We have people on the ground in Europe, Canada, and the US, and then we have partnerships around the world. So, for example, in the Middle East, we have just announced a partnership with Inclusion Partners, and we have partnerships in Asia and in Latin America. And what we do is support multinationals with their efforts around the world around diversity and inclusion. So we've been doing research for many, many years. And then we take that research and we put it together into actionable solutions that help corporations on their journey. So that includes knowledge and learning products, measurement tools, and advisory services. And then we bring our community together to champion the mission, to share best practices and learn from each other. We currently have research actively going on in 4 areas. One is around women and the future of work, which is something we started when I first started at Catalyst 2 years ago, which with this global pandemic, we found that honestly, everything's just been turbocharged, all the things that we talked about in the future of work. We have a whole initiative on leading with equity and inclusion, which is about building inclusive workplaces with a strong focus on intersectionality on a global basis and looking at all the differences, the diversity around the world. And we have an initiative called MARC, Men Advocating Real Change, which is how do we bring men into the picture so they can be allies and supporters of women. And in fact, I want to mention that we have a conference coming up, the MARC Summit, our first ever virtually on December 3rd and 4th. And I direct you to our website because everyone can participate. And even if you can't make the time of the event, you can listen to it afterwards. So it's totally virtual and totally global. And lastly, we have a strong practice on women on boards. And, you know, listening to the presentation before, what we do in that practice is important for Turkey. We actually mentor women with people that are already on boards and already directors and bring them into the network so that they can go on their first board. So that's a little bit about Catalyst. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. That was great. And now I have to be transparent with the audience. When we were just chatting while waiting for our role to start, our panel to start, of course, the discussion came to The Crown, the new season of Crown. As Mary, a baroness, was with us, it was kind of obvious to go into that direction. But my question is not about that. Now, Mary, I mean, I'm so impressed with you because you're one of the founders of 30% Club, of course, with Selena Morrissey. And the aim was increasing the number of women on UK boards. My question would maybe give you also the chance to be a bit more general about how did you get involved in promoting women's rights? Why do you feel so strongly about the issue? Maybe it's an obvious question, but also what was the biggest challenge when you started 30% Club in UK?
So I put it very quickly into 2 parts. First, I became involved in women's issues and rights when I was in my 6th form at school, because there was different issues happening in the United Kingdom that made you feel you actually had to start taking a stand. And I was privileged to be elected as one of the youngest councillors in the United Kingdom in the late 60s, early 70s, and from then onwards. In terms of the 30% Club, when I and Helena decided to find and to set up the campaign, and it is a campaign, it's not a non-profit. We see at the end of the day, our job will be done, but we've succeeded so far well, but there's a long way to go. We found that people tried to say that we were a women's group, and we had to explain to them that this is not a women's issue, it's a business issue. And that if you have 51% of the population missing, then you can't make a good job. You know, so that's where we had that first battle. And we also knew that to be able to achieve anything, it had to be men and women working together. And also we knew we needed to get the chairman and the CEOs, both men and women, of the top FTSE 100 countries in the United Kingdom to sign up with us. And that's what we did. And you see it on our webpage, both in the United Kingdom and where we have our international chapters.
Okay, wonderful. Maybe a follow-up question, a short one, Mary, on this one. You said that when we started, we were kind of hoping to reach that 30%, and then our job would be completed. But right now I can see that 30% is still evolving and growing now internationally. Give us maybe a feeling about what would be the next aspiration for 30% club from your perspective.
Well, we have a global mission now where we see 30% to 50%, and in 1 or 2 countries, they do have quotas, those who are members of the European Commission, European Parliament, and so on. But taking that aside, we also want to see better diversity on boards, and we've made a mission statement about that. And also, it's not just on boards, but it's through the pipeline, and that is through mentoring. We have a big mentoring scheme, and also through the MBA scholarships that we have got around our international chapters. And further through education, and we help start speakers for schools, and working with schools, getting people like yourself and Lorraine and other friends to go to speak to the sixth form in schools. During this period, a number of us have still been doing this virtually, getting to 800 children or young people. I'm doing one next week to 2 sixth forms. So it's education from the start. For girls to know that every door is open to them, wherever you're coming from. That's the important message.
Wonderful. So you're going down to the grassroots.
We have to go down to go up, up, down, bottom up.
Wonderful.
I hate that phrase, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah. Exactly. Wonderful. Maybe just a reminder to our participants, to the audience, that Lorraine and Mary will be happy to answer questions. Please direct your questions to us through chat, and I will be happy to submit them to both of them. Now, back to you, Lorraine. When we first launched this initiative with Sabancı University, and we started visiting chairpersons and CEOs of big listed organizations, I still remember, and I'm sure Melsa would confirm, one of the things we heard was, are you asking us to compromise from competence by asking us to appoint female directors to our board? And this is something, it's not, I think, heard only in Turkey. So people around the world, when they have the question in front of them, they would say, you know what, we're just looking at competence, it's not race, gender, or anything. Maybe could you elaborate a bit on that? How can we respond to that when we hear that comment from the decision makers?
Well, that is really a false narrative, in my opinion. First of all the research, and listening to the presentation of the IMF earlier, collaborates that more diverse boards are better decision-making, that the results of more diverse boards are better financially. And because of that, we see the investor community, we see the regulatory community driving for this. So it's not only the right thing to do from an equity standpoint, it is the right business thing to do for success. And organizations and companies who do not lean into this are not going to be making as good decisions. I will refer to this, that there's a great correlation between women leaders and how we're working through the pandemic. And I want to highlight that, because I think that more collaborative working that many women have been culturally developed to have is what we need in the 21st century, because we have very complex decisions, and you need to have the whole population represented, as Mary said. So if someone says that, they are not looking hard enough, they're not being intentional enough. It is amazing to me, because I talk to a lot of women who want to get on boards, and highly qualified, and that is not just women, but also women of color. There are more than enough out there. It takes intentionality. It takes going out of your comfort zone, going out of your immediate network, going out of just talking to your friends that you play golf with. You need to broaden the circle, and that takes work. And that's why, more and more boards are working with search firms and trying to expand the pool. But, we've made a lot of progress. I think that companies today who do not want to put women on boards are really going to be left behind. They already are. There's no board in the Fortune 500 now that doesn't have a woman on the board, and most of them are getting close to having 3. And the goal of 30% that, the 30% Club put in place, we're getting very close to that, and it's an accelerating pace right now, because of all the focus that came out of the Me Too movement, and then the focus that came out of the George Floyd issue on diversity. There's real intentionality now, and if you look at the numbers from even like last month, like 50% of the seats went to women, like 40% of those were women of color. So people are really stepping up to this right now. So I think the day of having boards that don't have women and diversity on them, it's we're going to be looking at the rearview mirror on that in general, especially for large public companies.
Can I just come in? Can I just come in on the back of Lorraine? One of the good points when she says this, also, we now have the investors, and investors are not happy to invest in companies that do not have women on boards. And that reporting is now out there. We'll come to that in a minute, but I just wanted to back up that the investors, which the 30% Club and Catalyst have worked very hard with to get the investor groups to work with us to persuade companies that this is the right thing to do. And they can see that.
And they're doing it because they know that the numbers are there.
Oh, the numbers, of course, they're interested in the bottom line.
Yes, let me tell you, that's why they're doing it. I mean, you can look at the Bloomberg Index. I mean,
Yes.
Also, there's a lot of wealth moving to women, and the women are investing, and they are also, focused. And millennials and Gen Z, they're focused on all the ESG measures. So, the stakeholder capital, the focus on this is where the world is moving. And the pandemic has just turbocharged that, because we understand our interconnectivity, and we understand the need for equity.
Absolutely.
Well, as you can see, I made myself obsolete with these wonderful panelists. So I'm just watching, just like many of you. So it's great to be here. I have a better seat, that I can guarantee. But actually, Lorraine, I was going to ask you, what would happen if the current board statistics would continue for the next decade? But you kind of implicitly answered that there's no way that it would happen.
Well, and if it does happen in a particular country, because it could be something global, but I just looked at the statistics for Turkey, and they're not exactly where everyone wants them to be. So different dynamics in different countries can affect that, but it can affect the company's future and the country's future if they don't address these things.
And I think Turkey, a bit like Mexico, one or two other countries, have a number of family-run companies. And those, I think, will change in the next period, because they will look for other investors. They have very bright daughters, very bright daughter-in-laws, and their grandchildren, and so on. So, and I have seen this in Mexico, and I know in Turkey that will change.
Yeah, and that was talked about in detail in the report, because I was listening to it, and we are embarking on a new generation and much more women involved in those family businesses, and that's really great.
And they've all done MBAs and everything else, and if they haven't, they're about to take them. Well, we're moving to a new era coming out of COVID, and there's no going back.
Well, Mary, one thing we again hear a lot in this country, but also in many other countries, although as 30% opposes quotas, when we look at the landscape, the European landscape, there are not many, if any, countries which has achieved a certain diversity level at the board level without the quotas or without regulations. And I'm, by the way, a big fan of quotas, so let me put it aside. But what I would like to get from you, what is the secret sauce behind UK's success and 30% success doing this without the quotas?
Well, we, Helena and myself, with others than 50%, persuaded Prime Minister Cameron not to sign the European Convention, one of the conventions, to have percentage of women on boards, because we felt it would be better for it to happen the way it's happened. Because once you get to a quota, it's hard to change, if people feel, oh, we've done the job. And in some countries, there is the same women being appointed to all the boards, not a, And in Britain, we have corporate governance, so that you're on a board either for 1 term or 2 terms, and you have the rotation off. And also, we felt that we had a huge amount of women out there who could achieve this, going through the pipeline, and also Prime Minister Brown coming towards the end of his term and Prime Minister Cameron coming in, both had agreed this was the time that we ought to really make a push for women on boards. And not only was it at the same time came through women on boards, gender, the gender pay gap, and the reporting. So as the boards report now, the FTSE 100 and the 350 have to report on board makeups, on the gender pay gap in their companies, and also on the environment now and sustainability. So all of this is coming naturally, and companies know they have to sign up to it. The investors want it. The Bank of England supports this. So it's had government across the divide. It's not just one government, not one political party. It is across the political divide that this is the right thing to do. And also in the devolved parliaments of Scotland and Wales, they're all signed up to this.
And please correct me if I'm wrong, Mary, but I've heard maybe legends or stories about ministers sending letters to the chairpersons of companies.
Oh, yes. When Lord Davis, the famous Davis report, was invited to chair the Davis Commission at the same time as the 30% Club launched, and the Financial Times came behind us all, the great newspaper of business. The ministers and Lord Davis wrote to all the chairmen of the FTSE 100 to start with, saying to them, you have to make a change. It's the right thing to do. And gradually, and then ministers started to write, and ministers spoke to chairmen and spoke to CEOs to make this change. So it was a government buy-in. You know.
I even heard that it was in the letter that, will you be the last one to carry this shame?
Well, I didn't quite see that in the letter, but there's lots of but there was there was phone calls and and the report. And now we're coming out of COVID, but this year the portal's there, so they've got to report. But coming out of COVID, the publishing of where companies, because all of this is published annually as well, so everybody knows where everybody is. There's no secrecy; it's full transparency.
Okay. Now you were chatting about this. Strength of capital markets and the investors kind of pursuing the business imperative behind the diversity at the board level. And Lorraine, to you, of course, the capital markets in general are quite established, and the investors community are quite strong in many of the let's say established economies. But when it comes to emerging economies, as we have discussed briefly about Turkey, even in the listed companies, the dominance are for people or for families. And therefore, the investors are not yet a strong community. Do you see that changing, or any kind of best practices, anything you can share with us?
Well, the statistics do reflect that in, the Middle East and Latin America, in Africa and Asia, the numbers trail Europe and Canada and the U.S. And I think it does have to do with the maturity of the markets. It has to do with the family businesses. I think that perhaps that's a place where quotas can help drive this. I'm not necessarily advocating for that, because I basically agree with Mary that it's good to have people understand that this is the right thing to do. But I think we had the conversation. The world is changing. We live in a global world, and while it may be slower, the family businesses are changing. The women in these families are changing. The investments community is maturing in these countries, and we will eventually see change. So I think it's more a matter of time and maturity. And so I think I'm really hopeful. I have to say that the UK, because of the regulatory work that has been done, is driving the numbers in the pipeline, which is even more critical. We've made a lot of progress on the board, and it's easy to know what the board numbers are. And in fact, it's somewhat easier to move the board numbers. As Mary was saying, if you have quotas, you can find the 100 women on the country and you can place them on all the boards and you've solved your problem, or you can take your friend and put them on the board and you can solve the problem. What you really want is the community, the investment community, the civil society to drive this, and also drive it in the pipeline. And the work that the UK has done and Australia has done, and to drive reporting that information is the next big hurdle in my mind. In fact, Catalyst just announced an initiative called the Gender and Diversity KPI Alliance. And what we are doing is we took numbers on metrics that came out of the World Economic Forum, IBC, the International Business Council, put a framework around ESG measures, and there were several on diversity and inclusion, and they had to do with representation and pay equity at the board level and through the pipeline, and encouraging companies to measure that, and eventually they will make them public. I mean, in the United States, very small percentages of the companies are actually making these numbers public, but at least they can measure them, and then there's going to be investor pressure to make them public. So, this is the next horizon of where we're driving to, is to move to the pipeline.
I'd just like to add to Lorraine, is that you can't just put anybody on a board, as Lorraine and I know, because it's also, you're responsible for everybody's home, you're responsible for their children, and you're responsible for many things when you're on a board. And I don't think some people always realize that. And further, we want people on boards to look at the supply chain and how workers are being treated, and also for when contracts, as we know, are in Africa and in India and in other places around the world, that workers throughout are treated properly. And when you have women on boards, they ask those questions. And they also ask questions on the audit committee and so on. They don't just sit there and say, yes, we're all happy. So that's important. And that's why, coming back, is in the pipeline, women are asking those questions as they come up to, and they're learning to ask those questions. They know it's the right thing to question.
Maybe at this point, one of the questions from the audience, from our good friend Ahu Özyurt, who's done great things as the editor-in-chief of Woman TV. She says, maybe to you, Mary, is there a need to push women to claim that seat on the table? When you were doing the 30%, was there a kind of a pipeline issue in terms of supply matching the demand because of increased number of seats?
No, there wasn't a problem about supply. There was a problem with the headhunters and the search firms. And they would say, oh, there's nobody out there. The chairman doesn't want to be bothered with that. And so we then took the search firms to the government. So we then got an arrangement between the search firms, sort of that they would report on how many women they had placed in different categories. There was plenty and continues to be around the world, plenty of the right caliber of women there. And so by persuading the search firms that they had to change the way they're working, that also made a big change, so that company chairman would say, we want 6 candidates. Well, we were saying to them, well, you've got to give at least, 20, 30% of those have to be women. So we had to unlock the search firms, which, as Lorraine and others in the room know, that's an even tougher job, because they know who's out there. And it's for us to say, add to that, because we know there's many more women educated today than before as lawyers, architects, accountants. You look at the big four, you look at the law firms alone, look at the architects firms, you look at builders on the ground, project managers, women are there at every level, historians, academics. Because also we looked at universities about the amount of women who are head of colleges and on university boards, and we got a commitment in our government that 50% of the public boards, which are like the BBC, or others, that we would have 50% of those would be women chairman, and a better makeup of those boards.
Yeah, I'd like to weigh in on this question a little bit as well.
Please.
There are some policy things that boards can address. So first of all, term limits. In most boards, in the Fortune 500, they have no term limits, and people stay on for a long time. So you don't have turnover on the board. You also can add a seat if you want to and change the dynamics. You can make sure that you have a nom and gov committee that works with real intentionality and demands that you see a diverse slate, at least 50%. There is no issue of qualified women, I can tell you that. It's a matter of doing the hard work to get it done. You can also have sponsorship programs to help first-time women get on boards, like the one we have on Women on Board program. So, the right governance really leads to better objectives.
Absolutely. That is key, turnover. And
wonderful. Well, I don't want to show off, but I think Mary would know that in UK, my firm, Egon Zehnder, is kind of constantly on the list of search firms appointing the most number of female directors. So I'm proud of that. But you're absolutely right. And by the way, for your information, we've done a similar coalition of search firms in Turkey with the initiative of 30% Club. So that's kind of signed and sealed. I think it's a very important step going forward. Maybe going back to Lorraine at this point, we can maybe talk about a bit like advice, because there was also another question about in terms of the capabilities of women who are preparing themselves for the board level, and there are quite many of them who are now in the audience. From your perspective, Lorraine, I don't know if you're doing those kind of research or activities as well to increase the capabilities of women or to guide them towards the board journey. But in any case, what would be your advice to prepare themselves for that campaign?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking it. First of all, I think women should think about their trajectory earlier in their career. And this is for moving forward to be in leadership roles and be CEOs of companies, as well as getting on boards. You have to think about getting the right experiences, because people want people on boards who have been general managers, who have a variety of and diverse experiences. And this is also true for competing up the ladder. So getting line jobs, getting sponsorship, expanding your network of people who will support and endorse you for the key jobs. Those are the same people who can support and endorse you for the board. So, when you want to get on a board, you need to already be in a place where you have enough diverse experience that you're board ready, and that takes years to move forward to. Most people are not, their career objective is not to be on a board. Their career objective is to build a meaningful career and advance in their jobs. But if they have an eye on the board service at the same time and start to work on that when they're at in the C-suite or just one level down from the C-suite, that's the time to really expand that networks. But it takes a lot of intentionality, because you've really got to expand that network more broadly. You've got to understand how to present yourself as a board candidate, which the skills are different, what people are looking for, and you need to highlight the skills that are important to a board. Boards are trying to service committees. They're trying to deal with risk. Many boards now are very concerned with technology because we have big technology transfer. So they need to think about from that perspective. So, really understanding that in the trajectory of a career is what I would advise.
And then I think the other two things that are vital is to understand risk management and cyber. Because the tech side, as Lorraine has said, is vital, but also to understand risk management and cyber now, because they are the other two key things. And we hope that women will be, when they're on the board, to be able to chair those committees and so on. So that's really important, Lorraine. Thank you.
Wonderful. Mary, a question to you. Again, one of the, let's say, comments that we hear all around the world, in a world like this, where we have the pandemic, financial crisis, risks, budgets, competition, how can diversity or inclusion be a priority for companies? What would be your answer to that?
It has to be a priority. If you think that 80% of the financial decisions in a family or in however you say the family, are made by women. It's women who decide what car to buy. It's women who decide what food, what clothes for the children, what insurance. I mean, most financial decisions are made by women. And also, why would you not have a woman on your board when they make up 50% to 51% of the world?
Wonderful. Lorraine, do you want to say something on that?
Yeah, I do, because Catalyst has done research during the pandemic to understand how CEOs are thinking about this. And we did a survey that shows that 70% of CEOs are thinking that this is going to be more important post the pandemic than ever before. And so the focus on equity, not just women, but having equity, diversity in their ranks and on the board is even more important. So we at Catalyst, because we deal with these companies all around the world, are seeing increased intentionality. We're seeing, honestly, we have increased supportership at Catalyst has gone up remarkably during this pandemic. We see companies really walking the talk, not just talking the talk. So, for years people would talk about this, but now they're really trying to do the things that it takes to understand how to build inclusive workplaces where everyone belongs, understand how to really advance women and underserved communities in the pipeline. It takes a lot of intentionality, and it's coming from the top. We see also changes in policies around paid family leave, around flexible and remote work, around promotion policies and hiring policies. So, we're seeing that for the reason that Mary, started out at the very beginning, because investors and companies that want to be successful are seeing this key to hiring and retaining the best talent. They're seeing what their investors want, and they're focused on stakeholder capital, and they're looking at the responsibility of companies being beyond just the bottom line, but into their role in society. So it is the right thing to do. It's the smart thing to do. And we're seeing a lot of intentionality. So while in some ways women have been affected, there was a lot of discussion by the IMF earlier. We know that women lost their jobs because they're on those frontline jobs. We know they have the childcare burden, but I think that we're going to build back better. And, I'm certainly committed to work with my companies to make sure we do build back better.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Well, the questions are pouring in, but I just want to kind of refer to Mary's point about 80% of some of the major decisions made by women. And of course, it's not the agenda of today's discussion, but I also believe that women from that perspective have the chance of choosing the credit cards company which respects diversity, or the services company, or the consumer goods company, so that they would in a way give the positive message to the good role models. So I just want to kind of underline that as well. There is a question about the gender pay gap, which you mentioned, Mary. What could be the good ways to kind of, or best practices to close that? I mean, you mentioned about reporting, which has started in UK a few years ago. And are there anything else that you would like to suggest on that dimension?
Yes. Britain passed the fair employment legislation when somebody who's unfortunately died, but is very historic, a person called Barbara Castle. And it was her, when she was a minister in the 70s, that we passed legislation about equal pay, and equal pay for equal work, men and women being paid the same. And there's a very famous film called Made in Dagenham, and it's about women who are making the car seats for the cars all around the world. You know how car factories are global. So one part's made in London, one part's made in Turkey, etc. And that showed that men and women working side by side were paid differently for making the same same piece of seat for the car. And that really sets out the whole question of equal pay. And we've had a number of cases with local authorities not paying equal pay, and also companies. So more and more, they're having to pay the same pay for the same job. And that is why transparency on what people are being paid, being out there, then you have to know it. So equal pay and we're saying to companies, you have to publish, and the FTSE 100 and the FTSE 300 have to publish where they are on equal pay. And that is seen every year, except just this year, but it will be back on top again next year. But equal pay is really important, and it helps to retain staff because they know where everybody is, in the same way as paternity leave and maternity leave.
Yeah, I'd like to just weigh in on this a little bit as well, because I want to nuance it a bit. Because if you look at the gender pay gap numbers that are reported, and also the raw pay gap that comes in the UK numbers, it's really made up of two elements. Equal pay for equal work for the exact same job, just the way Mary showed that example. And the other thing is the ratio of what men and women are making more broadly. That number is affected by equal pay for equal work, but also how many women are at different levels in the organization.
Right, absolutely.
So, I want to say that there's been a lot more progress on equal pay for equal work. The larger companies in general have gone in and audited, and the Fortune 500 companies, they are in general trying to get in compliance with that because of all the hard work that's been done. But the other piece of this, which is, that, for example, even in the same pay grade, a woman could be doing, an events job, and the man is a trader, and they're making 5 times as much money for the same exact job. Or, you just have, all the women are bank tellers and the men are running all the top jobs. So so we need to work on the pipeline issue, and those numbers reflect both of those issues.
But as I said, we have had cases in the United Kingdom with local authorities around carers, at that level, around lawyers at that level, bankers at that level, around teachers, so there is case law from top to bottom, and it is right, but the pipeline is key where you get all these anomalies.
Actually, another related question just came in, which maybe I'll first ask it to you, Lorraine. The pandemic situation also creates some, especially at the mid-level, women to leave their jobs for different reasons, because of unemployment or the contraction of the economy, but also related with the family, taking care of the family. And the question is there a way to avoid that? How can we try to maybe win back days? Because that would also have an effect on the pipeline, as you mentioned.
Well, that's a great question. In fact, I wrote an op-ed in Fortune that you can refer to all about this, and we've done research on this. So first of all, it is absolutely true, especially women early in their career who have family burdens are being affected by this much more than the men. In fact, in the US in September, the statistics were there were 1.1 million people lost their job, and 893,000 of them were women. And that is because of this very issue. We know that women have more unpaid labor. We know that they're taking up the childcare burden. But on the other hand, it's put a light on these inequities, and it's also put everyone in the same boat around the parenting issues. And, men and women both are trying to solve this problem. So, some of the things we're telling companies to do is to lean into supporting childcare expenses, lean into flexibility, lean into paid family leave, really look at this holistically, even just financially. If someone leaves the labor force and you have to replace that person and reskill them, it's a lot more expensive than trying to help them through the childcare issue over what hopefully will only be a few more months. But in order to do that, you've also got to train your managers to be empathetic and be inclusive leaders. They've got to understand what is the lived experiences of these people who are having these experiences, so that they're willing to come and talk about them, so that you can do the work-life balance that you need to do, so that you can help them through these periods. And the report that we did on parental is that 40% of the people first of all, they may not even be aware of the help, and they're afraid to tell people about the issues that they're having until they have a complete crisis, and then they just leave because they're afraid they're going to be laid off. They're afraid they're not going to be, they're not going to be able to talk about it. So you need to really have empathetic leaders, and that empathy is a quality that we think is going to follow through even after the pandemic.
Okay. Mary, maybe a question to you. You mentioned this gender pay gap issue. We also talked briefly about, or implicitly about, the rotation at the boards or the background of directors at the board level. All of these, in a way, go to good governance. And actually, in line with what you say, it's not a woman's issue, it's a business imperative that we're talking about. Again, either through your 30% journey or from your other experiences at different level, because you also have the political hat as well as the business hat. What would you say governance-wise could be the, let's say, couple of practical things to be done, either for the business owners or business community, as well as the policymakers?
I think it's really important for good corporate governance that boards have a rotation. Not everybody comes off at the same time, and that the chairman may do 2 terms of 5 years each, where board members do 2 terms of 3 or 1 of 5, because you don't get that clubby situation. Also, if there's a problem in a company, if you have a board that rotates, and they're not looking over their shoulder to be able to stay, but they're looking to look for the next board because they've done well on that board. And it is wrong for a company to have the same people running it. I don't want to be offensive to America or for other countries, but I do know that people get onto something there and they're there forever. I also feel quite strongly about this, not only on public board, on FTSE 100, I feel on family boards it should be this way, and I also feel very strongly and advocate it too for non-profits. I think that some people are on non-profit boards for too long. We also have it on, our hospitals are run by hospital trusts. There again, there's the same corporate governance on that, and on government boards, because all our departments have non-execs as well, and they're for fixed terms and rotate off. The only time that somebody's allowed to stay on a bit longer is if a company is in a crisis, so the chairman may stay a further year while they're getting another chairman to come in, because it's a bit difficult. But the whole rotation makes the difference, and it makes the difference to the economy of that board as well.
Wonderful.
I just wanted to add another point that I neglected to talk about, is that it's important to open the lens of who can serve effectively on the board, because there's often been narrow, you have to be a CEO of a Fortune 500 company. Well, honestly, if you want, for example, a woman of color to be on your board, if there's only 3 in the Fortune 500, so you've got to change the spec, and there's no reason why the spec has to be so narrow. So this gets back to the search firms and helping broaden the search criteria.
And also, there are great women of color and men and so on out there who have this experience, who've been working in law firms, who work in accountancy firms, and all the others. So as the search firms should know, it's not difficult to find them. And we're in a global world, so people don't necessarily have to be American or British or Austrian. As we see more and more boards becoming global as well, and that's really important for the company.
Well, we're just approaching the last 10 minutes, but we've got a couple of more questions. But I would like to add to the last point, which is I've just seen a research, I think, which was sponsored by Intel for Generation Z. And interestingly enough, one of the outcomes of the research was 56% of the respondents said they do not want to work for a company where diversity candidates are among the leadership ranks. So they want to see it happening before joining that company. So there's also the war for talent perspective for the up and coming talent. Lorraine, maybe a related question, which is on a different context. One of our participants in the audience says, if I'm working in a corporate environment and I see that there is no kind of an organic way to go towards that bold path in that environment, not in another company, but in that environment. Should I try to go into that war and struggle to make it happen, or should I maybe switch lanes and try to strengthen my campaign in another company?
Well, I tell young people all the time when I speak to them that finding the environment where you are culturally aligned is really critical. When I was entering my career, I went to work for IBM, and I decided coming out of business school to go back to IBM, even though I had a lot of other opportunities, because they had women in leadership, because they had work-life balance, because I could see role models, and I thought I could build a career. And, I think it was a good choice. It is really important to look at the leadership, to look at the culture, to understand. And also, I would say to make sure that the things that you do well and how you want to build the career are in the line of what the organization is all about. Because if you end up in staff roles that are not aligned with the line, what the organization is all about, you're less likely to end up in leadership roles over time. So I would say that it's really critical, but it's also critical, as we're pointing out, that companies need to evolve with what to attract talent, and having diverse leadership is part of this, not only because it makes better decisions, but because, as you just pointed out, attracting the right talent, especially with the Gen Z and millennials.
Well, we implicitly discussed this, or I think, Mary, it's you who mentioned that during this pandemic, we've seen that female state leaders, female political leaders have demonstrated a significant track record, significantly better than some of the male leaders. At least that's what the results show. But I would like to close the panel with a positive note. So I would like to ask the same question to both of you, but starting with you, Mary. Assuming and not assuming, we are sure that all of our efforts to kind of go towards that equality from a gender perspective and diversity are accomplished. What type of a world would you envision?
I would hope that there'd be a world of respect for men and women, respect for religion, and respect for people's views. But I think coming out of COVID, I hope that people understand about respect, because if you think around the world of all the cross-section of people who've been on the front line in hospitals, in ambulances, on the street, looking after people, it's a great cross-section of people. And I think we all ought to learn to respect everybody.
Wonderful. Lorraine?
Well, I think equity is the word of today, and we need to get to a more equal society. I mean, I think the two major crises that we are facing are climate change and equity. We are seeing our commonality on our connectedness, and we need to have a more equitable society. And, the U.S. is founded on equal opportunity, but it's a continuous process. We're constantly striving to move forward to make that a reality. And in a connected world like we have right now, it's an imperative that we make that happen. And we use this crisis as an opportunity to make a great leap forward.
Absolutely.
Well, I don't think if there's another or a better way to conclude our discussions today, two kind of really interesting words, equity and respect. And that's the world we would like to live in. And for that, we have to continue our efforts. We have to continue struggling at some times. But I hope the participants in the audience are as inspired as myself to listen to these great panelists today. So once again, on behalf of 30% Club, on behalf of Sabancı University Corporate Governance Forum and Egon Zender, I would like to thank them for being with us today and sharing their experiences, sharing their suggestions so openly and so generously. And thank you for listening, and thank you for your patience. So all the best from us.
Thank you very much. Great to us. Bye-bye, Lorraine. I'll be in touch, and with you, and to everybody else. Bye now. Bye.
Take care. All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye.
We would like to thank all our panelists for sharing their valuable opinions and experiences. We have come to the end of our conference. We thank you for your participation and wish you healthy days.
Hello, welcome to the academic panel of the 8 Women Directors in Turkey Virtual Conference. My name is Itır Akdoğan. I'm the Research Director of Turkish Economic and Social Studies Foundation, and I will moderate this panel. This afternoon in this panel, we will discuss future directions in research on gender diversity in corporate board and leadership. What we will discuss actually is how research with evidence and findings based on scientific analysis can feed decision makers in corporate governance in their policies for inclusion in boards and leadership. We will first discuss findings of academic research on gender diversity in corporate boards and leadership, and what more inclusive boards mean for companies. And based on this discussion, we will then tell about the future research agenda and how research and corporate governance can be connected for a more inclusive and equitable future for corporate governance and leadership. We will have 2 rounds of questions, and then I will ask panelists your questions. So please feel free to submit your questions to the panelists. And then the team behind the scenes will send me your questions and I will address them to the panelists. For this panel, I have 3 distinguished panelists. They are all professors of finance joining us today from different universities in Europe, but they are more international than this. You can check their bios more in detail in the conference website. Then you will see that their education, their careers, their research, their cultural backgrounds, they are all very global. So what we will hear today comes from very high expertise, but also from a very global journey. So I'm really looking forward to hear from our panelists. I have Dr. Burçin Yurtoğlu from WHU Otto Beisheim School of Management from Germany. I have Dr. Rina Adams from Said Business School, University of Oxford from UK. And I have Dr. Daniel Ferreira. He's Head of Department of Finance in London School of Economics. I welcome you all to the panel. Well, for the first round, as I said, we will discuss, I will ask the panelists to share with us the findings of their research on gender equality in corporate governance. And I will start with Mr. Yurtoğlu. Burçin Bey, your recent publication, actually together with Melsa Ararat, is about the relationship between female representation in boards and firm value and profitability in Turkey. You seem to collect data from a very large number of companies, listed companies, and also a rather long time covering 2011 and 2018. So you seem to find different kinds of relation, different findings for this relation. Can you please share us your findings?
Okay, thank you very much, Itır.
You have 7 minutes and I started now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Itır. It's great to be part of that panel, especially with Renee and Daniel, who have really done groundbreaking work in that area. As you mentioned, Melsa and I, we analyzed the gender diversity in Turkish boards, and we have come up with a couple of results. But before maybe explaining what they are, it's important to give a rough idea of the legal background or environmental background of gender diversity in Turkish boards. Here we have to go back to 2012, where corporate governance principles were introduced in their revised version, and they included a new principle of gender diversity for the first time in Turkey. So firms in 2012 by corporate governance principles have been recommended to have sort of at least one woman director in their boards. And this has been introduced on a compliant explain basis, and that had almost no impact on how firms decided on their boards. In 2013, the Capital Market Board of Turkey revised the principles and recommended that firms should set a target percentage of not less than 25% of women on boards. And they should also announce a date to achieve that target. Okay. As of 2018, this is roughly where we started to do that project. Only one company had set both the targets and announced a date to achieve it. So also that has been largely ignored by Turkish companies. So after 2012, gender diversity on boards has very gradually increased from almost 12% of the board size to little less than 16% in 2019. And the ratio of women among the independent directors has gone up from almost 8% to 18%. And that demonstrates probably that the increase, the small increase in gender diversity in boards has been largely due to the appointment of independent women directors, okay? So what do we do in that study with MELSA? I mean, we, as you said, we analyze in a usual regression framework. So we don't really have a quasi-experimental design. The relationship between firm value and profitability and various measures of gender diversity of corporate boards. And we obtained some results that I believe are interesting, at least from a Turkish perspective. So maybe first result would be if you look at the measures of gender diversity in boards, in Turkish boards, that are mandated or recommended by most legislations around the world, then you don't really get anything. So there is no relationship, there is no association between such measures and firm value and firm profitability. So it's zero relationships. However, you get something. I mean, you start to get some positive association between firm value and profitability if you look at that relationship from a more granular perspective. So if you, for example, take into account the identities of female directors and boards, then you get some interesting results. They are weak results, but still you get some statistical correlations. Namely, if female directors are members of controlling families, then we start to see a relationship, positive relationship between firm value and the presence of that type of female directors. On the other hand, you start to see a relationship between independent female directors and firm profitability. So identities or differentiating among existing identities of female directors matters. The second result that may be interesting is related to the roles of female directors in boards. So if you look at the involvement of female directors in corporate boards via their committee memberships, via, for example, audit committee membership, corporate governance committee membership, risk committee membership, and so on, we find two things. First of all, board memberships predict firm value and profitability. Again, weak relationship, but statistically there. And secondly, that relationship starts to get stronger as the number of female directors in these committees starts to increase. So we find something like similar to a critical threshold story, which might indicate that for female directors to make a difference, they should be in larger numbers and not simply present as tokens maybe in these committees. And then there are a couple of other results. So if you maybe ask whether the presence of female directors has a relationship between different types of firm behavior, then we find, for example, that the presence of female board members decreases the probability that a qualified or adverse audit opinion will be issued. And that type of association is stronger when female board members are assuming more active roles in board committees. We also study and find evidence, even albeit with a smaller statistical significance, that firms with a high degree of female representation on boards have a smaller probability of non-compliance with regulations and violations of securities law. Okay? And also, we see some relationship between the presence of female directors on boards and stock price crash risk. And stock price crash risk has been traditionally interpreted as a measure of boards hoarding bad news. So maybe that results might indicate that female directors deal more effectively with information. There are a couple of other results. I mean, I think the next one is quite interesting. All these tests can be run by contrasting and comparing female directors or the respective category of female directors with the same category of male directors. So if you run such comparisons, so if you directly compare male versus female directors, you find little difference in terms of male versus female directors. You find a little, but generally speaking, male versus female does not really matter. It's the identities and roles that are played rather than the associated genders. This is a weak result, but the only statistically significant results indicate in this direction. And maybe one final result is that whether female directors matter more for some types of firms and less for other types of firms. I mean, if you go through such an analysis, then you find that female representation matters more in firms where inside ownership is much higher, and also in firms where board independence is higher than other firms. So that's, in a nutshell, what we have found with Melsa Ararat from Sabancı University in that paper. So overall, to sum up, there are a couple of differences that female directors might make. You would see these differences if you really take a granular perspective and go into the board committees. Otherwise, it's very hard to see them. And overall, I need to mention that there are little differences across male versus female directors if you explicitly control for that. And the economic significance of these results are not overwhelmingly large. But overall, female directors seem to make small and significant difference. So that's from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for seeing us all. Talking about differences, we have next an interesting research from Rene Adams about the differences of differences, actually. Rene, you studied with Patricia Funk how gender differences in boardroom differ from gender differences in society, like the differences that we know more generally in society that they reflect on the boards. Can you please tell us more about this research and how these differences of difference make any impact for companies?
Yes, thanks very much for inviting me. So I have some slides. Will they be posted or do I post them myself?
I think you sent them already to the conference team. They should be able to share. I cannot see the screen myself now, but
oh, okay. Will they be?
I'm sure they share the team.
Oh, okay. So they'll. So we can't see the slides. Is that right?
No, I can't. But if you couldn't, I would have received a message from the team. I didn't, so we should be safe.
Okay, so I'll just talk as if I can see them. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Will it be okay for you?
Yeah, that'll be fine.
Oh, okay.
So I just put them up. Sorry about that. I thought we'd be able to see them, but yeah, thanks very much for inviting me. So basically, with Danielle, we did some research which relates to what Borchan was talking about, where we showed that the relationship between board diversity and firm performance is very nuanced. So it's not always positive. Sometimes the magnitudes are small, and actually, you can even get negative relationships. And so one question that Patricia and I set out to look at when we studied Swedish directors was whether one could potentially explain this some non-results with the fact that once women reach the boardroom, they're the same as men. And so the question we were really interested in is there really a case for gender diversity once you reach a certain level of leadership? And so what we did is, the first thing that we did is we compared Swedish directors to the Swedish population. And what we compared the directors on were something that's called the Schwartz Human Values Survey. And so Shalom Schwartz has a system, he's a psychologist, he has a system of human values. So there's 10 human values, and we surveyed directors on these human values. And then we also had the same human values for the Swedish population. And so what we could do is we could compare the Swedish directors to the Swedish population. And the first thing that we found was that directors are very different from the population. And so that's probably not very surprising, but so the men are very different from the men in the population. The female directors are very different from the women in the population. But what's interesting is that, you know, the differences were in some sense partly unexpected. And as a result of these somewhat unexpected differences, what we observe is that once men and women reach the boardroom, there are actually very big differences between their characteristics. And so what that means is that there actually could be a role for gender diversity beyond the glass ceiling. So they're not the same. Men and women in boards are not the same, but also some of the difference are unexpected. And so sort of an implication of our research is that one has to be careful about stereotyping women in particular, and sort of predicting in which way one thinks women will behave once they reach the boardroom. And in particular, one can't infer from the population what women in leadership might be like. Okay, so I want to illustrate this. So I'm assuming that that the slides are up. So basically, also with Melsa Ararat, Borchen's co-author, we did the exact same thing that we did for Sweden for Turkey. So we surveyed Turkish directors, and we also had these measures of human values. And what I have on the slides, so the first slide shows differences between, in the values, in these 10 human values and 2 other measures, between men and women. And the way the graph, so it's a bar chart, the way the graph is plotted is that if the bar is to the right of 0, that means men emphasize this value more than women. And if the bar is to the left of 0, that means women emphasize this value more than men. Okay, so I don't have much time, so I'll sort of just walk you quickly through the results. Basically what we find is, and now remember, we're talking about Turkish board members, right? So male directors in Turkey are more achievement oriented than female directors. Female directors are more benevolent than the male directors. The men are more conformist than the women. The men are more power oriented than the women. The men are more security oriented than the women. The women are more self-directed. They're more stimulation oriented. The men are more tradition oriented. The women are more universalist. And then I have 2 other measures. The men are more risk averse than the women. Let me say that again. The men are more risk averse than the women. And the men also care relatively more about shareholders than stakeholders. Okay, so and so basically, if you see the bar chart, what you see is a lot of the bars basically deviate from 0. So what does this mean? It means men and women are different in the boardroom. Okay, and this is really important because it means that yes, diversity can matter. Right, so there is a case to be made that we need women in the board because they do bring different perspectives. And in this case, what we're measuring is they have different values than men, okay? And having different values may be important. Now, I'd like to emphasize again, now, well, I guess there's a couple of interesting things. So first, men and women are different, but also women are not as expected necessarily. So there are 2 things that may stand out here. So first, remember I repeated the risk aversion point. So the men are more risk averse than the women. The standard story is always that the women are more risk averse than the men. And so what this finding suggests is that the women who make it into the board or onto boards are very different from women in the population. They had to overcome many risks to get there, to get to the boardroom. And so when we think about how diversity may matter, it's maybe not the way people expect. Okay. And I guess I don't have much time, but I just want to say a final point. If you go to the next slide, please. So I'm assuming that the next slide is up. What I plotted there is the difference. So now I'm looking at the difference in the conformity value between independent directors, or actually it's dependent directors who are executives and independent directors. So that's the blue bar. And also the difference between men and women. And so what you see on the chart is that dependent directors, so these are the executives who work for firms, are more conformist than independent directors. So this is exactly what governance theory predicts. So independent directors, their role is to break up the conformity, to stop the rubber stamping, right? That's exactly why we appoint them. So they're not supposed to be conformist. And so the fact that the blue bar is to the right of 0 means that, yes, the independent directors are less conformist than the executives. But now you look at the red bar and you see that the red bar, which is the difference between men and women, is much bigger than the difference between dependent directors and independent directors. So what does that mean? Men are significantly more conformist than women. So if you really want to shake things up in the boardroom, what these results suggest is maybe you should appoint a woman instead of just appointing an independent director. Okay, so I'll leave it at that and we can get back to the results maybe later.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much, Rina. This is really very interesting finding. Thank you so much. And now over to Danielle. Danielle, you had a team of women researchers. You co-published actually quite recently, last month, with Edith Ginglinger, Marie-Aude Laguna, and Yasmin Scully. And then you studied the gender quotas, actually, how gender quotas and hiring practices interact. So can you please share your rather inspiring evidence from your research?
Sure, thank you. And of course, so our paper is about gender quotas on boards. And let me start by saying that there are already many papers looking at the effect of quotas on firm performance, which is obviously an interesting question to look at. But I would also argue that it doesn't address some other questions which I find very interesting and important, and specifically how the quotas change the way in which firms recruit directors, right? So it works roughly like this. So quotas will disrupt the normal functioning of the market for corporate directors, because it will force firms to select, directors based on gender. Now, and by doing that, the quotas may affect the composition of the board beyond gender. And it's great that I'm presenting this after René's presentation, because that's exactly what I'm talking about. Once you force firms to consider and hire more women, other aspects of the board are going to change as well. The composition of the board is going to look different beyond just the gender attribute. And this could be good. This could be a good thing. It could be a bad thing. It could be neutral. It depends on the situation. And that's also something we want to investigate in this paper. Now, generally, I would say there are two possibilities. First, you have the argument of those who oppose quotas. They would say, well, if you select directors purely on gender, this could lead to the selection of women that don't have the required experience, qualifications, and independence, right? So I would say that this is the main argument of those who don't support quotas. But on the other hand, on the other side of the debate, you have those who believe that the market for corporate directors is not fully efficient, is not a meritocracy. You have the old boys network and all that. So what the quota can do is to force companies to review the way that they recruit directors, review their practices, and expand the pool of female and male candidates as a consequence of that. So what do I have in mind to be more specific? So if you're recruiting people mostly through a network, mostly through the network of people you know, and if your network doesn't have enough women, then the quota will force you to look outside your network. And to do that, you may have to use a different method for recruiting directors altogether, such as, for example, hiring a search firm or a headhunter, okay? So, and consequently, you end up not only hiring more women, but different people, okay? So this is what we investigate in our paper. So we consider the introduction of a board gender quota in France in 2011. And let me say first that France is a good case to analyze, especially because in France, the business elite is very easy to identify. These are the graduates from the elite schools, which are the grande école in France. So these graduates are disproportionately represented on corporate boards, and this is something we can measure, so this is not just a conjecture. And they're also disproportionately male, which is also something we can measure. Why is that? Well, many of these are engineering schools, and some of which didn't even accept women until the 70s. So it's not surprising. Things are getting better now, but still history is a main determinant here. So what we find is that, the first thing we find is that after the quota, the first thing that companies do is to try to retain the women they have. Okay, so the tenure of women on boards increased by more than 50%. And tenure here is just the average time that they stay on the board. So this suggests that boards are just holding on to the women that they already have. This indicates that firms find it costly to change their recruitment methods so much that they actually try to retain the ones they have for longer and significantly longer. And this is particularly true for those firms who are more reliant on networks in which women are underrepresented. And I guess we also find, perhaps less surprisingly, that there's an increase in the number of women recruited and also a decrease in the number of men. So it's not just that the firms are just holding on to the women they have, but they are also hiring outside their network as well. So then we turn to the question of how director characteristics change after the quota. So we start by showing that before the quota, there are significant gender gaps in many director characteristics in France. So before the quota, female directors are younger, less independent, less experienced, and less likely to have studied in an elite school than male directors, right? What we see that after the quota, all of these gaps have changed to the better, okay? So the gaps have either narrowed or remained unchanged. So we find that overall, boards become more independent. We have that female directors after the quota are more independent, more experienced, and more internationally diverse than those hired before the quota. And most of the other gaps, qualification, expertise, age, have been narrowed or remained unchanged. So overall, what we see is that the quota serves as a push towards closing the gender gaps in those director characteristics. So to conclude, our evidence presents a paradox. Firms find it difficult to hire women after quota, as evidenced by the fact that they try to hold on to those that they want, even though the female directors that they do hire after the quota don't seem any worse than the ones that they hired before. If anything, they seem better, okay? So what is a possible explanation for this? So one possible explanation for this puzzle is that the introduction of the quota forces firms to abandon those recruiting practices that tended to under-recruit qualified women. So now they can tap into a deeper talent pool. So I just want to say, so that's essentially what our paper showed. So I just want to say, so why does it matter? Why do we care about this? Well, these changes in hiring practices may have trickle-down effects that will percolate through the whole economy, which have like significant implications for the labor market for business professionals. And this could have positive externalities, such as forcing these firms to consider a larger pool, which will lead to very positive consequences for the career prospects of women in business. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. So I thank you all very much. These are really very inspiring and encouraging findings, actually. Like depending on their identities, women finding says that have an impact on firm value and profitability, what Burçin said. And then Rine actually gives this really interesting findings that women and men might be different, but not the way we know in the street, but that they are differently in boards, and whatever position, please hire women because they will bring more interesting impact on the companies based on different criteria. And then Daniel says that the quotas actually help more qualified women to be included in this talent pool to be picked from the boards. And it looks like women in boards make a difference in different ways. So this is actually the context, the findings that we had today. And based on this, now in the second round, I'd like to ask you questions about the future research directions and how this can be connected to decision makers for the corporate governance. So I will start again with Burçin Bey, and I will ask, what do you think the corporate decision makers need to learn next from researchers, and what do you yourself plan researching on next?
Okay, thank you. I mean, it's a tough question, but I'm going to simplify what I think. I mean, we have to, I think, combine the new findings coming from research on gender diversity with findings coming from broader governance. For example, in related research or from related research, we know that across at least emerging markets, what matters in corporate governance is a combination of board independence and better disclosure. I mean, other firm level characteristics hardly matter. And in the gender context, one can combine these findings into a sort of quota or recommendation with respect to increasing the number or the number of female directors or the presence of female directors in combination with board independence. So for a Turkish context, probably recommending or mandating a higher degree of board independence hand in hand with a higher degree of gender diversity would make sense in Turkey. What I'm going to do next in terms of this research, I mean, what I think is or might be interesting in a Turkish context is to understand what drives the presence of female directors in Turkish boards. There is very little evidence on what drives firm governance in general, in specific for Turkey, but also there is almost no evidence that might explain the presence of female directors in Turkey. Intuitively speaking, I would expect that shocks to governance, also shocks to gender diversity in corporate boards would come in waves. So you would see something like a increase within a couple of years and nothing happens afterwards. This is what I would expect, and this is what I'm planning to analyze next. So interaction of firm governance with measures of gender diversity in Turkey. One could then be in better shape to answer questions like, I mean, do firms, for example, with better governance have a higher degree of female presence? Would female directors matter more in firms with better or worse governance? And if so, what would drive these differences? I mean, I don't know anything on these issues, and there is also not much evidence coming from other emerging markets on that. So that's what I'm planning to do next. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now over to Rine. Rine, you actually have a huge experience of connecting different actors generally in decision making. So I want to ask you actually how you think in general research should be connected to decision makers in corporate governance world, and how you yourself plan to connect your research with decision makers for gender diversity.
Yeah, like Borchan said, difficult question, right? So I think academics always struggle to connect their research to people making decisions in the real world, right? There's always a bit of a disconnect. And I think diversity is especially interesting. Problem is especially interesting in the diversity context because it's a very sensitive subject. And also there's a lot of ideology involved. And so, it's very difficult to sort of, to broach the subject and have people have honest discussions about this, right? And where people don't feel like they're being criticized if you say, well, maybe you should do things this way, or, one important, Danielle mentioned the quotas, right? So it's also sort of interesting. If you look at quota documents, you see that not many of the policy proposals in the space actually mention academic research, which is quite frustrating, right? So what can we do, right? And so I guess several things, right? We come to places like this, we present our work, and we hope that we can touch people and that people will listen. But also, going forward, I'm trying to work more on sort of more practical aspects. So what can we do practically? If you say, well, diversity adds value, is it just appointing women, or does one need to do more? And I think that brings us a bit into the space of thinking about workplace practices. And so that's where my future research is going to go. I'm going to work a bit more on sort of internal firm processes and try to develop sort of a set of best practices that could then be used to say, well, this is how you can translate the research into action. Of course, this is very ambitious because getting the data to be able to do this is not easy, but that's sort of the hope.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, it is not easy, but it is highly needed. So good luck with your work. Now, finally, to Danielle, my question to you is how you think researchers in gender unequal countries should design their research for more inclusive boards.
Okay, so I think that the most important thing is to move away from trying to make a business case for women on boards or in business overall. So I think that those who support policy initiatives like quotas and other things, they often make a business case for women on boards, and this business case can take many shapes or forms, but it usually amounts to showing that some women on boards are positively related to firm value or profits, and you cite different papers, including sometimes, my papers with Renee and sometimes other papers. But I think I'm skeptical about of this strategy. And don't get me wrong, I think that from an academic perspective, it is interesting to consider the effect of gender diversity on firm performance. I've done that, and other people have done that. This is perfectly fine. But I don't think that these academic interests should be conflated with policy. I think that this reliance on a business case can easily backfire. So, because if you make a business case for women on boards on the basis of any kind of evidence linking women to profits, then logically you have to accept the conclusion that there is a business case against women should the evidence show it the other way around, should the evidence show that women reduce profits. And honestly, I don't think that's the discussion we want to have, right? So I think that's not the direction that I would like to see this going. So, and also my reading of the overall research on this topic doesn't really support the business case, but it doesn't provide a case against the quotas either, right? So but I don't think this is a problem. I think that when we're discussing policies that promote women in business, it is better to focus on the potential benefits to society that will go far beyond the narrow measures of profitability. So coming back to the main question, right? So my advice to researchers, especially those in gender unequal countries, is to try to come up with a research agenda to make a positive case for more research on the reasons why there are few women on boards in the first place. So that will be my first goal. And this is what Renee, my friend and colleague, also called the barriers to boardrooms, right? So what are the reasons why women find barriers to get on boards? Okay, so I think this type of research naturally forces us to think about the frictions that can actually be corrected by the interventions. So to conclude, I think researchers, especially in more gender unequal countries, they should focus on questions such as the labor market for directors, the recruitment practices, the determinants of labor force participation, the government policies related, for example, to childcare, but also on issues such as the functioning of labor markets in general, and also the sources of explicit and implicit discrimination, which may also be a problem here, right? And when thinking about the metric, thinking about the goal, consider the benefits to society as a whole and not just to business.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniel. I have a note from the team. If you excuse me, I have to read it in a second. Okay. Okay, sorry, I had to read from the team. So I understand that it is important to connect policy and research, but in a meaningful way. And it is not easy task for academics to do, but we all agree that it has to be connected. But as Daniel says, like especially for countries where there is this lack of equality, so they have to focus more on the reasons why rather than on the profit of business. And Burçin said that next he would like to research on things where he will also learn himself, and it will be the relationship between firm governance and gender diversity policies. My questions are over, so I thank you very much, all three of you. I will go to my email to see if there are more questions than I received already on the chat box. If not, yeah, I have an email. Yeah, actually, Dr. Yurtoğlu has a question. When he said that, Burçin Bey, when you said that women members of the board as themselves does not make any difference unless we check the identities that they have. So you said that it's more a question of identity than gender itself. And then an attendee asks you to give an example to elaborate this.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the first thing that I said was, I mean, the gender diversity measures, which are broad measures, I mean, it is these measures that don't matter. So if you just, for example, look at which fraction of directors are female and try to relate that to different outcome measures, then you will not get much. This is what we have found. If identities refer to who the directors are, and I mean, there are multiple, of course, dimensions of that question. We differentiate between members of the founding or owner family. So it matters whether the female director is a member of the is a controlling shareholder or not. Okay. It matters whether the female director is an independent director or not. Okay. And then the second dimension was whether the directors were taking active roles in board governance by being members of the various board committees. Most importantly, I mean, in Turkey, that would be the audit committee, and to a lesser extent, maybe corporate governance and risk committees. And it is these differences at that level of granularity that we analyze that question. So with respect to identities, I think the most important thing is whether you are independent versus you are part of a controlling family. And if I may add another sentence, I think this, at that point, the question becomes complicated. Because assume that for whatever reason, you pursue a policy of increasing the presence of female directors in Turkish corporate boards. Basically, Turkish firms will have two ways to get there. One is you can appoint someone from your family. I mean, if you have a daughter, if you are a member of the controlling family, if you have a couple of daughters, you are going to appoint them. That's going to work because there's nothing in the regulations that prohibits that. And there is also intrinsically nothing wrong about that. On the other hand, you can go and try to find an independent female director. In terms of what we know about controlling shareholders and board independence and so on around the world, these are going to be extremely different things. So you cannot really say that this is going to be equivalent to each other. Okay, that's why I said if you want to design boards from a policy perspective, maybe you should think about board independence and gender diversity together. I mean, it's not really important to focus on one of them. So these two have to be designed simultaneously.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Let me check once more if we have a last minute question. Looks like no. But that is the end of the audience questions. If you have last words to add, you can do it now. Otherwise, I will thank you all. Okay, so thank you very much for sharing your work. Danielle, did you want to say something?
I was just going to say thank you.
Okay. I thank you all very much. It was really interesting to hear your findings and how you will continue this journey for a more inclusive and equitable future. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Atır. Thanks.
We would like to thank all our panelists for sharing their valuable opinions and experiences. We have come to the end of our conference. We thank you for your participation and wish you healthy days.